Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we are continuing our quiet exploration of the ancient world, not as it is often presented in dramatic headlines or simplified myths, but as it appears when we sit patiently with the oldest texts and allow them to speak in their own careful, restrained way. These are stories meant to be approached slowly, without urgency, without the need to reach a conclusion too quickly. They are meant to be listened to the way one listens to wind moving through a distant landscape, present but unforced, carrying meaning without demanding attention. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether the world outside your window is already dark or just beginning to fade, take a moment to settle in. If this journey feels calming or intriguing to you, a quiet gesture of support through liking or subscribing is always appreciated, but only if it feels right to you. There is no rush here. We're not chasing answers. We're allowing questions to unfold. Tonight, we're approaching a subject that at first sounds almost unthinkable, even irreverent when measured against traditional views of the ancient gods. The question itself feels dangerous, as though it might collapse something fundamental if examined too closely. Did humanity, the creation, the labour force, the dependent species, play a role in the disappearance of the gods who once governed the world? And if so, was this an act of rebellion, or simply the slow consequence of proximity, pressure, and time? This is not a story about swords raised against the heavens or armies marching toward temples in open defiance. The ancient texts do not describe such scenes. Instead, what they offer is something quieter and more unsettling, a gradual change in tone, a shift in responsibility, a subtle reversal of dependence, a world in which the gods begin to complain, withdraw, negotiate, and ultimately fade from direct involvement, while humanity continues forward, altered but intact. The earliest Mesopotamian records do not present the gods as distant abstractions. They are present, they eat, they sleep, they grow irritated, they depend on offerings, they require labour, they complain about noise. These are not the traits of untouchable cosmic absolutes. They are the traits of beings embedded within a system, beings whose authority depends on structure, cooperation, and participation. In the oldest layers of Sumerian literature, the gods are not introduced as eternal or invulnerable. They are introduced as emerging within a framework that already has limits. They are born, they organise themselves, they divide labour, they argue, they assign burdens, and very early on, they encounter a problem that is not external, but internal. Work is required to maintain the world they have ordered. Canals must be dug, fields must be maintained, cities must be built, offerings must be prepared. The system does not sustain itself. Humanity enters the picture not as a miracle, but as a solution, a response to divine exhaustion. The texts are explicit about this. Humans are created so the gods may rest, so they may be relieved of labour, so the burden of maintenance can be transferred downward. From the very beginning, this relationship is transactional, not devotional. Humanity exists because the gods need something. That detail alone reshapes how we understand everything that follows. A creation born of necessity is not the same as a creation born of love or reverence. It carries tension within it from the first moment, and the text quietly acknowledges this tension without dramatizing it. As humanity multiplies, something changes. The labour is performed, the fields produce grain, the temples receive offerings, the cities grow, civilization expands, and with expansion comes sound, activity, density. The gods who once demanded human presence begin to recoil from it. They complain about noise, they lose sleep, they express irritation not with disobedience but with success. This is a critical turning point. The problem is not rebellion, it is proximity. Humans have fulfilled their role too well. They have filled the world too thoroughly. The gods, once dependent on human labour, now experience humanity as a disturbance rather than a support. When authority begins to experience its foundation as a burden, it seeks correction. In the Mesopotamian worldview, correction does not begin with dialogue. It begins with reduction, floods, disease, mortality, limits imposed not as punishment for moral failure, but as mechanisms of control. What follows in the text is not a single event, but a pattern. Each time humanity grows too numerous, too active, too present, divine intervention occurs to restore distance. The flood is the most famous example, but it is not isolated. Shortened lifespans, increased suffering, reduced access to divine presence. These are not described as tragedies by the gods. They are administrative decisions, yet even here, something unexpected happens. Humanity does not vanish. It adapts, it survives, it rebuilds, and more importantly, it remembers. Memory becomes humanity's quiet power. The gods do not erase knowledge completely. They regulate it. They ration it. They allow fragments to persist. After the flood narratives, the tone of the text changes. The gods appear less frequently. Their interventions become indirect. Temples remain, but presence fades. Authority is expressed through ritual rather than proximity. Kings rule, but they do so as intermediaries, not as companions of the divine. This shift is rarely emphasized outright. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes the new normal. The gods no longer walk among humans. They are invoked instead, appeased, remembered, feared, but not encountered. And here, a quiet possibility emerges, one the texts never state directly but consistently imply. If the gods withdrew not because they were defeated, but because they could no longer remain embedded within the world they had shaped, then humanity did not need to raise a hand against them. Survival itself was enough. A system that depends on labour will eventually be reshaped by those who perform it. A hierarchy that relies on proximity will eventually erode under the weight of its own success. Humanity did not overthrow the gods through rebellion. It may have simply outlasted the conditions that made divine presence possible. The gods, in these texts, are not immortal in the way later theology would demand. They are sustained by offerings. They require temples. They depend on correct ritual. They diminish when neglected. This is not metaphor. It is mechanics. The divine economy operates on exchange. As humanity becomes more autonomous, more capable of managing agriculture, law, and memory without constant divine oversight, the gods become less necessary as active administrators. They shift into symbolic roles. Guardians of fate, judges of the dead, abstract forces rather than embodied presences. This is not presented as a victory or a tragedy. It is presented as a transition, one that unfolds slowly, without spectacle, one that leaves traces rather than conclusions. If humanity did play a role in the end of the gods, it was not through violence, it was through continuity, through persistence, through adaptation, through learning to carry the weight of the world that had once required divine maintenance. And this raises an unsettling thought that the ancient texts seem to circle without naming. Power that cannot withdraw without consequence is not absolute. Authority that must be enforced rather than accepted is already eroding. Presence that becomes intolerable to itself is approaching an end. The gods did not disappear all at once. They thinned, they retreated, they delegated, they became quieter, and humanity remained. This is where our exploration begins, not with rebellion in the conventional sense, but with the conditions that made rebellion unnecessary. With the possibility that the gods did not fall because they were destroyed, but because the world they built no longer required them to stand within it. From here, the story continues forward, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper understanding of how dependence, authority, and survival intertwine in the oldest memories humanity ever preserved. There is a noticeable shift that begins to appear in the oldest texts, one that is easy to overlook if one reads them quickly, or approaches them with assumptions already in place. The gods are still present, still powerful, still invoked with fear and reverence. but something subtle has changed in how they are positioned within the world. They are no longer described as entirely beyond reach. They are no longer framed as forces that exist wholly outside the systems they govern. Instead, they begin to appear as participants within those systems, affected by them, constrained by them, and in quiet ways, vulnerable to them. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamian thought, divinity is not synonymous with invulnerability. The gods are powerful, but they are not abstract absolutes. They exist within time, they occupy space, they experience fatigue, they require sustenance, they complain. These are not later corruptions of a purer theology. They are present from the beginning. The texts do not hesitate to show gods who sleep, who eat, who grow irritated when conditions are unfavourable. This portrayal is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which power is relational rather than absolute. To be untouchable is to be unreachable, immune to consequence, unaffected by the actions of others. But the Sumerian gods are none of these things. Their authority depends on structures that must be maintained. Their comfort depends on human labour. Their peace depends on human restraint. When those conditions change, the gods react, not with serene detachment, but with frustration and intervention. One of the clearest indicators that the gods are no longer untouchable lies in how often they are depicted as responding to pressure rather than issuing commands from an unassailable height. They react to noise, they react to population growth, they react to disorder. Reaction implies vulnerability. It implies that something external has the capacity to disturb the divine state. The gods complain about humanity not because humans disobey them, but because humans exist too fully. Cities expand, fields are cultivated, daily life becomes dense and continuous. The sound of civilization rises. This noise is not metaphorical, it is literal. The texts describe clamour, restlessness, activity that disrupts divine rest. A god who cannot sleep is a god whose authority is already compromised. Sleep is not a trivial detail. Sleep represents limitation. It marks the boundary between power and exhaustion. When the gods are said to lie awake, disturbed by human activity, the texts are making a profound statement about divine limits. These beings are not endlessly self-sustaining. They require rest. They require quiet. They require a controlled environment. From this point onward, the relationship between gods and humans begins to invert. Humanity was created to relieve divine labour, yet humanity's success produces new burdens. The solution becomes the problem. This is where untouchability erodes, not through rebellion, but through dependency that has grown unstable. Another indicator appears in the way divine authority is enforced. In the earliest phases, the gods establish order directly. They assign roles, they shape the world. Over time, this direct involvement gives way to corrective action. Floods, plagues, decrees that limit lifespan. These are not creative acts. They are regulatory measures. They suggest that the system is no longer self-correcting. A god who must punish to maintain distance is a god who can be affected by proximity. A god who must reduce humanity to regain silence is acknowledging that humanity possesses disruptive power simply by existing. The texts never describe humanity attacking the gods. There are no scenes of revolt, no wars against heaven, no coordinated defiance. Instead, the erosion of divine untouchability happens through accumulation. More people, more activity, more labour performed without constant supervision. Over time, the gods move from being central figures within daily life to being invoked authorities whose presence is mediated through ritual. This mediation is critical. When a god must be accessed through priests, offerings, and carefully maintained ceremonies, direct contact has already been lost. Distance has been institutionalized. What was once immediate becomes symbolic. What was once personal becomes formal. The gods begin to reside in temples rather than landscapes. Even then, the temple is not the god. It is a dwelling, a point of contact, and over time, Even that contact becomes conditional. Offerings must be correct. Rituals must be precise. Errors bring consequences. The relationship becomes contractual rather than communal. Contracts can be broken. They can expire. They can be renegotiated. A God who exists within a contractual framework is no longer untouchable in the absolute sense. Their authority depends on participation, on recognition, on maintenance. There is also a shift in how divine bodies are described. Earlier texts freely acknowledge that gods eat bread, drink beer, enjoy feasts. Later texts become more restrained. The physicality of the gods fades from emphasis. This is not refinement, it is retreat. Physical presence becomes harder to sustain in a world filled with humans. The flood narrative crystallizes this moment. The decision to destroy humanity is not framed as moral judgment. It is framed as irritation. Humans are too noisy, too numerous, too close. This is an extraordinary admission. It suggests that the gods cannot coexist indefinitely with the world they have enabled. When Enki intervenes to preserve a remnant of humanity, the tension becomes explicit. Gods argue with each other. Decrees are circumvented. Authority is no longer unified. A system with internal disagreement is not untouchable. It is fragile. After the flood, the changes are permanent. Lifespans shorten dramatically. Divine presence becomes sporadic. Kings no longer rule for tens of thousands of years. The boundary between divine and human solidifies. This is often interpreted as the gods reasserting control. But it can also be read as withdrawal under pressure. A god who must retreat to remain powerful is no longer untouchable in the way they once were. They are preserved through distance, not dominance. There are moments in later texts where gods are injured, captured, threatened, or deceived. These episodes are often dismissed as mythic embellishment, but they fit a broader pattern. The divine is no longer beyond consequence. It can be trapped in the underworld. It can be bound by rules. It can be forced to negotiate. In the descent narratives, even the most powerful deities are subject to judgment. They must pass through gates. They lose symbols of authority. They die temporarily. Death itself touches the divine, even if only symbolically. This would have been unthinkable in a system where gods were truly untouchable. What emerges instead is a picture of divinity that is powerful but conditional, influential but embedded, sustained but not self-sustaining. The gods depend on the world as much as the world depends on them. Once that balance shifts, authority becomes unstable. Humanity does not need to challenge the gods directly to change the system. It only needs to persist, to continue building, to continue remembering, to continue performing rituals while also developing structures that function independently of constant divine presence. As cities grow, law codes emerge. Kings govern through administration rather than divine encounter. Writing preserves memory without requiring revelation. Over time, the gods become guarantors rather than governors. Untouchability fades not with violence, but with relevance. This is not presented as a triumph of humanity over the divine. The texts do not celebrate it. They simply record it. A world once saturated with gods becomes a world that references them instead. And from this point onward, the gods are still feared, still honoured, still named, but they are no longer immune to the consequences of the world they shaped. They are no longer beyond reach. They are subject to history. The erosion continues quietly, without declaration, carried forward by the same forces that once required divine intervention to manage. Human continuity, human memory, human adaptation. From here, the story does not turn toward open rebellion. It turns toward strain, toward tension, toward the first moments where obedience is no longer the defining feature of the divine-human relationship, and something more complex begins to take its place. The strain does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with a declaration of conflict or a dramatic rupture between heaven and earth. Instead, it seeps into the record quietly, through small changes in emphasis, through repeated complaints, through subtle adjustments in how the relationship between humans and the divine is described. If one is not attentive, it is easy to mistake these moments as incidental or symbolic, but taken together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. At first, the relationship between humans and gods appears functional, almost mechanical. Humans work, the gods rest, offerings are made, order is maintained. This is not framed as oppression or cruelty. It is simply the structure of existence. The gods created humanity because labour was necessary, and humanity performed that labour. In return, the gods provided stability, fertility, protection, and access to the ordered world that made survival possible. The arrangement is presented as mutually beneficial, at least in principle. But even in the earliest texts, this balance is described as fragile. The gods do not trust that order will maintain itself. They oversee constantly. They issue decrees. They intervene. This alone suggests that strain is always anticipated, even before it becomes visible. As human populations grow, the scale of activity changes. Villages become towns, towns become cities, fields extend farther, canals grow longer. Irrigation systems become complex networks rather than isolated efforts. This expansion is not merely economic, it is sensory, it fills space, it generates sound, it alters landscapes. The gods notice this not because they are threatened in power, but because they are affected in comfort. The texts are explicit about this. Human noise rises, it disturbs divine rest. The clamour of civilization reaches the heavens. This is not framed as metaphor for sin or disobedience. It is described as irritation, as disturbance, as something physically disruptive. This detail is crucial. The strain begins not with rebellion, but with success. Humanity is doing exactly what it was created to do. It is cultivating the land. It is building cities. It is maintaining temples. The gods receive offerings in abundance, and yet the very abundance of human activity becomes intolerable. This is the first contradiction. A system designed to rely on human labour becomes destabilised by the effectiveness of that labour. The gods do not complain that humans are lazy or negligent. They complain that humans are too present. The language of complaint appears repeatedly. Gods grumble. They convene assemblies. They express frustration. These are not the actions of beings who are entirely detached from consequence. They are reacting to conditions they cannot simply ignore. One of the most telling aspects of this strain is how it reframes divine authority. In earlier descriptions, the gods establish order through creative acts. They separate heaven and earth. They assign domains. They bring forth life. As strain increases, divine action shifts toward correction rather than creation. Floods replace foundations. Plagues replace blessings. Decrees limit rather than enable. Correction implies that something has gone wrong. It implies that the original arrangement is no longer sufficient. The gods are no longer shaping a world into being. They are managing a system that has grown unwieldy. This management is not elegant. It is blunt. The flood narratives are the clearest example. The decision to destroy humanity is framed not as justice, but as relief. Silence is the goal. Rest is the motivation. This is an extraordinary admission. It reveals that the gods experience humanity not as children, but as a burden. Yet even here, the strain does not resolve cleanly. One god disagrees. Enki intervenes. He preserves a remnant of humanity. This internal conflict among the gods is itself a sign of strain. Authority is no longer unified. The divine assembly is divided. Decisions are circumvented rather than obeyed. After the flood, the gods impose new limitations. Human lifespans are shortened. Mortality becomes fixed. Suffering increases. Disease appears. These are described not as moral consequences, but as regulatory measures. They are tools to reduce population, noise, and disruption. This introduces a new layer of tension. Humanity survives, but under constraint. The relationship shifts from cooperation to control. Humans are no longer simply labourers maintaining the world. They are variables to be managed. At the same time, divine presence becomes less immediate. Gods appear less frequently in daily narratives. Their actions are mediated through dreams, omens, and priests rather than direct interaction. This distancing is often interpreted as increased transcendence, but it can also be read as withdrawal under pressure. A god who withdraws is responding to strain. Distance becomes a coping mechanism. Temples become barriers as much as meeting places. Ritual replaces presence. Invocation replaces encounter. Another sign of strain appears in how humans are portrayed psychologically. Early texts depict humans as dependent, obedient, largely passive. Over time, humans are shown negotiating, appealing, reasoning. Kings argue their case before the gods. Heroes challenge divine decisions, sometimes indirectly, sometimes boldly. This is not rebellion in the modern sense. It is familiarity. Familiarity erodes absolute authority. When humans know how gods behave, what they fear, what irritates them, the relationship changes. Predictability replaces mystery. The gods themselves contribute to this erosion by expressing emotion. They regret decisions, they argue, they deceive one another, they are bound by rules, they are subject to fate. Each of these traits makes them more comprehensible and therefore less untouchable. The underworld narratives deepen this strain. Even gods are subject to judgment. They must pass through gates. They can be detained. They can be killed temporarily. Death touches the divine, even if it does not claim it permanently. This introduces a radical idea. The gods are not exempt from the structures they govern. Meanwhile, humanity continues. Cities are rebuilt. Kingship resumes. Agriculture flourishes again. Civilization adapts to new limitations. The gods are still honoured, but increasingly as guarantors rather than overseers. The strain is no longer explosive. It is structural. Humans rely less on constant divine intervention and more on inherited systems. Law codes replace divine decrees. Writing preserves knowledge without requiring revelation. Memory becomes independent of divine presence. This is not a conscious rebellion. It is a gradual rebalancing. The gods do not vanish because humans overthrow them. They recede because the world no longer requires their constant proximity. The texts never say this directly. They do not accuse humanity. They do not blame the gods. They simply record the changes. Fewer appearances, shorter lifespans, greater distance, increased ritualization. Strain manifests not as conflict, but as adjustment. A system under pressure does not always break. Sometimes it thins, sometimes it stretches, sometimes it retreats. What remains constant is that humanity persists, through floods, through decrees, through loss, through distance. The gods adapt to humanity as much as humanity adapts to the gods. This mutual adaptation is the core of the strain. From this point forward, the relationship is no longer stable. It is negotiated, it is managed, it is controlled, and control, once introduced, never fully disappears. The divine-human relationship has entered a new phase, one defined less by creation and more by containment, less by presence and more by memory, less by cooperation and more by regulation. And this tension does not resolve. It carries forward, quietly shaping everything that follows, setting the stage for authority that must be enforced rather than assumed, for obedience that must be maintained rather than given freely. The strain does not end here. It deepens. There is a noticeable change in the way the ancient texts speak about the relationship between humans and the divine, and it does not happen abruptly. It unfolds gradually, almost cautiously, as if the scribes themselves were aware that they were recording something delicate. earlier records emphasize order, duty, and alignment. Humans perform their roles. Gods oversee the system. Harmony is assumed, even when it is fragile. But as time moves forward in the textual record, a different vocabulary begins to appear. The language of obedience gives way to the language of tension. Commands are no longer simply followed. Decrees provoke reaction. Divine authority encounters resistance, not always openly, but persistently. This shift does not mean that humanity suddenly becomes defiant in a dramatic or revolutionary sense. The texts do not describe uprisings against temples or armies marching against gods. What they show instead is something more understated and more unsettling. They show a relationship that no longer functions automatically. Compliance must be enforced. Silence must be restored. Order must be reimposed. Obedience, when it is natural and unquestioned, does not require description. It is assumed. Conflict, on the other hand, must be explained. The moment texts begin to describe conflict is the moment obedience has ceased to be the default state. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamian literature, humans are rarely portrayed as decision-makers in their own right. They exist within a framework established by the gods. Their purpose is clear. Their role is fixed. They labour, offer, and maintain. The gods respond with fertility, protection, and continuity. There is little need to narrate disagreement because disagreement is not structurally possible within that worldview. As civilization grows more complex, the texts begin to reflect a different reality. Humans build cities that persist across generations. They develop administrative systems. They codify laws. They create archives. Writing itself becomes a means of preserving memory independent of divine presence. Once memory no longer depends entirely on ritual repetition or divine transmission, a subtle form of autonomy emerges. This autonomy is not celebrated, it is barely acknowledged, but it is there, and the gods respond to it not with approval, but with concern. The first signs of conflict appear in how the gods speak about humans, rather than how humans speak about the gods. Divine complaints become more frequent. The gods express frustration with human behaviour, not because it is immoral, but because it is excessive. Humans multiply. They fill the land. They generate noise. They disrupt divine rest. The problem is not disobedience, it is presence. This distinction matters deeply. A disobedient servant can be punished and corrected. A servant whose very existence is disruptive presents a different challenge. Correction no longer addresses the root issue. Reduction becomes the only solution. When the gods decide to send the flood, the language used is not the language of justice, it is the language of relief. The gods seek quiet, they seek rest. Humanity is not accused of violating a sacred law. Humanity is described as overwhelming the system. This marks a profound change. Humans are no longer simply tools. They are variables capable of destabilizing the divine order. Conflict enters the narrative not because humans challenge divine authority directly, but because divine authority is no longer sufficient to regulate human existence through ordinary means. The gods must resort to extreme measures to restore balance. After the flood, the tone of the texts becomes noticeably sharper. Human life is curtailed. Lifespans are shortened. Suffering increases. Mortality becomes absolute. These changes are not framed as temporary corrections. They are permanent conditions imposed to prevent recurrence of the same problem. The introduction of permanent limitations signals that obedience alone is no longer trusted to maintain order. The gods do not expect humans to remain manageable through goodwill or ritual alone. Control must be embedded into the structure of existence itself. This is where conflict becomes implicit rather than explicit. It is no longer expressed through open confrontation, but through systems designed to restrict human potential. Disease, infant mortality, barrenness, predation. These are not random hardships. In the texts, they are policies. Policies imply governance under strain. Another shift occurs in how divine commands are portrayed. Earlier texts present divine words as immediately effective. Later texts show commands that are negotiated, delayed, or circumvented. Enki's actions during the flood narrative are particularly telling. He does not openly defy the divine assembly, but he works around it. He finds technicalities. He speaks indirectly. He exploits loopholes. This behaviour introduces conflict within the divine realm itself. Authority is no longer unified. Decisions are no longer absolute. When gods disagree, the system is already fractured. Humans observe this fracture, even if the texts do not describe them commenting on it directly. Knowledge that the gods argue, deceive, and undermine each other changes how authority is perceived. A divided authority is easier to navigate. It becomes possible to appeal to one god against another. Favour replaces obedience as the primary strategy. The emergence of patron deities reflects this shift. Cities align themselves with specific gods. Kings emphasize their relationship with particular divine figures. Loyalty becomes selective rather than universal. This is not rebellion, but it is fragmentation. Fragmentation weakens absolute authority. Conflict also appears in mythic narratives where humans or semi-divine figures test the limits of divine control. Heroes seek immortality. Kings challenge fate. Mortals demand justice. These stories do not always end in success, but their existence is significant. They reflect a cultural imagination no longer content with passive acceptance. The gods respond to these challenges inconsistently. Sometimes they punish, sometimes they relent, sometimes they compromise. Inconsistency is itself a sign of strain. An authority that cannot respond predictably loses its aura of inevitability. As time progresses, the texts begin to frame divine intervention as exceptional rather than routine. Omens replace appearances, dreams replace conversations, priests interpret signs rather than hosting gods. This distancing reduces the immediacy of divine authority and increases the role of human intermediaries. Intermediaries accumulate power. Kings become administrators of divine will rather than mere servants. Law codes are presented as divinely inspired, but they are written, enforced, and interpreted by humans. Once written law exists, divine command becomes static. It can be referenced, debated, and applied without fresh revelation. Static authority invites conflict because it can be tested. The texts begin to describe disputes not just between gods and humans, but among humans themselves over divine favour, legitimacy, and interpretation. Who has the right to rule? Which god supports which city? Whose ritual is correct? Conflict multiplies as authority becomes layered. The gods are still invoked as ultimate arbiters, but their distance makes them less decisive in practice. Humans fill the gap. It is at this point that obedience ceases to be the defining feature of the divine-human relationship. Compliance continues, but it is negotiated. It is conditional. It is enforced through fear rather than trust. Conflict does not mean open warfare. It means misalignment. It means a system no longer operating smoothly. It means increasing effort is required to maintain order. The texts reflect this through repetition. Repeated warnings, repeated punishments, repeated disasters. A system at peace does not repeat itself this way. Repetition signals instability. Even the gods seem aware of this. They express regret. They reconsider. They impose new rules. They acknowledge unintended consequences. These are not the actions of untouchable beings. They are the actions of administrators managing a system under stress. Humans, meanwhile, continue to adapt. They rebuild after disasters. They reinterpret myths. They preserve memory. They learn to live within constraints while pushing against them quietly. The conflict described in the texts is therefore not a rebellion in the conventional sense. It is a structural conflict, a misfit between a growing, adaptive species and a divine order designed for a smaller, quieter world. Obedience fades because it no longer solves the underlying tension. control replaces cooperation, distance replaces presence, ritual replaces relationship. From this point onward, the divine-human dynamic is defined less by harmony and more by negotiation, enforcement and adjustment. The gods remain powerful, but their authority is no longer effortless. It must be asserted. This change does not conclude here. It deepens. As humanity continues to expand, remember, and adapt, the mechanisms of control grow more elaborate, and the distance between gods and humans grows wider. The texts will continue to record this widening gap, not as a single event, but as a persistent condition. And as that gap expands, the question of whether the gods remain untouchable becomes increasingly difficult to answer in the way it once was. From the very beginning, labour sits at the centre of the relationship between humans and the gods, not as a side detail, but as the reason humanity exists at all. The oldest texts are unambiguous on this point. Humans were not created to be companions, nor primarily to be worshippers in an emotional or devotional sense. They were created because work needed to be done. Canals had to be dug. Fields had to be maintained. Temples had to be supplied. The gods, having ordered the cosmos, found the maintenance of that order exhausting. In the early myths, this arrangement is presented as sensible rather than cruel. Labour is necessary. The world does not sustain itself automatically. Someone must tend it. When the junior gods rebel against their own workload, humanity is fashioned as a replacement workforce. The logic is administrative, not moral. Creation is a managerial solution. At first, this solution works. Humans take up the burden. The gods rest. Offerings flow upward. Stability is restored. The system appears functional, but labour does not remain static. It scales. As human populations increase, labour multiplies. Fields expand. Irrigation networks grow longer and more complex. Brick production accelerates. Cities rise where villages once stood. What was once localized work becomes continuous, collective activity that fills the landscape. This expansion produces something the gods did not fully anticipate. Sound. Noise becomes the unintended byproduct of human success. It is not merely the noise of voices, though that is part of it. It is the sound of tools striking earth, of carts moving along roads, of animals penned in enclosures, of markets operating daily rather than seasonally, of rituals performed regularly rather than occasionally. The texts do not treat this noise symbolically. They describe it as an irritant, a disturbance, something that reaches the divine realm and interferes with rest. This is one of the most revealing details in the entire Mesopotamian tradition. The gods are disturbed not by sin, not by rebellion, not by impiety, but by the sensory presence of humanity itself. The world has become too active. Noise here represents more than sound. It represents density, permanence, continuity. Humanity is no longer a temporary workforce. It is an enduring presence. Labour, which was meant to stabilise the divine order, begins to destabilise it through sheer accumulation. The gods receive what they asked for, and more than they can tolerate. The burden shifts. At this stage, the gods are no longer simply beneficiaries of human labour. They become managers of its consequences. Their role changes from overseers of creation to regulators of excess. This change is subtle but decisive. When authority shifts from enabling productivity to restraining it, the relationship has entered a new phase. The flood narrative emerges directly from this tension. The gods gather not to celebrate human achievement, but to complain about it. They do not accuse humanity of failing its duties. They accuse humanity of being too present. This complaint carries an implicit admission. The gods cannot coexist indefinitely with the world they have built if that world continues to expand. The solution they choose is extreme. Reduction. The flood is not framed as a correction of behaviour. It is framed as a reset of scale. Silence is the goal. The destruction of cities is not incidental. Cities are the source of noise. They concentrate labour, population and activity into spaces that never truly rest. By wiping them away, the gods attempt to restore the earlier, quieter state of the world. Yet even this solution fails to resolve the underlying problem. Humanity survives. Labour resumes. Cities are rebuilt. The noise returns, even if muted for a time. At this point, the texts introduce permanent constraints. Lifespans shorten dramatically. Mortality becomes unavoidable. Human life is no longer open-ended. It is capped. This is not presented as punishment for wrongdoing. It is presented as population control. A shorter lifespan limits accumulation. Fewer generations overlap. Density is reduced. Other limitations follow. Disease appears more frequently in the record. Infant mortality becomes normalized. Certain women are described as barren by divine decree. Wild animals become threats. These are not random misfortunes. They are mechanisms. The burden of humanity has forced the gods to redesign the system itself. And yet, even as these constraints take hold, labour does not disappear. Humans continue to work. They adapt their practices. They refine agriculture. They improve administration. They develop writing to manage surplus and obligation. Writing is particularly significant. It allows labour to be coordinated without direct divine oversight. Records replace memory. Contracts replace oral command. Systems begin to function independently. This independence is quiet, but it is transformative. The gods still receive offerings, but those offerings are now scheduled, recorded, and standardized. Ritual becomes routine. The divine economy becomes predictable. Predictability reduces urgency. It reduces immediacy. It reduces the need for constant divine presence. As labour becomes more efficient, the burden shifts again. Humans no longer require constant divine instruction to maintain the world. They inherit methods. They follow precedents. They operate within frameworks established long ago. The gods remain at the top of the hierarchy, but their role becomes less active. They are consulted rather than encountered. At the same time, the texts begin to reflect a subtle resentment, not always expressed directly, but implied through a repetition. Humans labour endlessly. They suffer disease. They die young. They endure disasters beyond their control. The gods, meanwhile, rest. This imbalance does not produce open rebellion, but it produces narrative tension. Stories emerge in which humans question fate, in which kings lament mortality, in which heroes seek escape from the limits imposed upon them. These stories are not accusations. They are expressions of strain. The burden of labour now rests entirely on humanity, while the benefits of order are unevenly distributed. The gods demand maintenance but withdraw from responsibility for suffering. This asymmetry deepens the distance. Noise, once the reason for divine intervention, gradually becomes normalized. The gods no longer respond with catastrophic resets. Instead, they allow the system to persist under constraints. This tolerance suggests resignation rather than control. The gods have accepted that humanity cannot be reduced beyond a certain point without collapsing the very labour structure they depend on. Destruction has limits. Silence cannot be absolute. At this stage, the divine-human relationship is no longer about creation or cooperation. It is about endurance. Humans endure labour. The gods endure noise. Neither side is fully satisfied. Temples continue to rise, but they are no longer sites of constant divine presence. They are symbolic centres, administrative hubs, points of negotiation rather than habitation. Priests manage offerings. Kings enforce order. The gods are invoked as guarantors of legitimacy rather than daily supervisors. Labour has reshaped authority. The growing burden of humanity does not overthrow the gods. It exhausts them. It makes constant presence untenable. It forces withdrawal not because humans are hostile, but because they are numerous, active, and persistent. This persistence is the quiet force running beneath the texts. Humanity does not rebel. It works, it survives, it rebuilds, it adapts, and in doing so, it becomes too heavy for the divine framework that was never designed to support such scale indefinitely. The gods respond by stepping back, by delegating, by abstracting their presence, by allowing systems to run without them, intervening only when necessary. This is not defeat in a dramatic sense. It is attrition. Labour continues, noise continues, life continues. The gods remain, but less tangibly. Their voices grow fainter, their appearances rarer, their authority more symbolic. The burden of humanity has not destroyed the gods outright, but it has reshaped them into something quieter, more distant and less involved. And as this burden continues to grow, the text will begin to show something even more unsettling. Authority that must be enforced repeatedly is authority that is weakening. Presence that cannot tolerate proximity is presence that is nearing its limit. From here, the story moves not toward open confrontation, but toward enforcement, punishment, and control, as the gods attempt to manage a world that no longer fits comfortably within the boundaries they once set. There is a moment in the record where authority subtly changes its character, and the texts preserve this shift with remarkable consistency. What was once assumed begins to require reinforcement. What was once internalized must now be imposed. Reverence, which had functioned as a stabilizing force, proves insufficient on its own. From this point onward, authority no longer rests comfortably in belief. It must be enforced. In the earliest worldview reflected in the Mesopotamian texts, reverence is not described as fear alone. It is familiarity shaped by dependence. Humans revere the gods because the gods are present. They're embedded in the rhythms of daily life. They regulate floods, fertility, and survival in ways that are visible and immediate. When a god acts, the result is tangible. The connection between cause and effect feels direct. Authority in this context does not need to be asserted repeatedly. It is experienced. As time passes, that immediacy weakens. The gods do not cease to exist, but they become less visible in daily affairs. Their actions are mediated through signs, omens, and ritual rather than direct presence. As this happens, reverence begins to change. It becomes less instinctive and more procedural. Procedural reverence is fragile. It depends on correct performance rather than genuine alignment. It can be neglected, misinterpreted, or resisted without immediate consequence. The texts begin to reflect this vulnerability by introducing enforcement as a recurring necessity. Punishment becomes more explicit. Threats appear where assurances once sufficed. Divine displeasure is invoked more frequently, not because humans have suddenly become wicked, but because obedience no longer arises automatically. This is a critical distinction. Authority that must threaten is authority that senses its own instability. The gods respond to this instability by formalizing their control. Ritual becomes rigid. Laws are codified. Consequences are enumerated. Missteps are punished not simply to correct behavior, but to remind humans that authority still exists. Floods, plagues, famine, and military defeat are increasingly framed as instruments of enforcement. These events are no longer rare cosmic corrections. They become recurring reminders. The message is consistent. Obedience is not optional. Yet the need to repeat this message reveals the underlying problem. Reverence has weakened. In earlier narratives, humans do not require reminders of divine power. They experience it constantly. In later texts, divine power must be demonstrated periodically to maintain relevance. Authority has become something that must be displayed rather than assumed. This shift is also visible in the role of intermediaries. Priests, kings, and officials take on greater responsibility for maintaining divine authority on earth. They interpret signs, they administer punishment, they enforce law. This delegation is often presented as divine wisdom, but it also serves another function. It transfers the burden of enforcement from the gods to human institutions. Authority becomes layered. Divine will is filtered through human systems. Once authority is filtered, it becomes negotiable. Kings rule by claiming divine sanction. They present themselves as chosen, favoured, protected. Yet their authority is exercised through human mechanisms, armies, courts, bureaucracy. The gods are invoked as justification, but enforcement is human. This creates a subtle inversion. The gods legitimize power, but humans wield it. The texts reflect this inversion cautiously, without overt criticism. They emphasize loyalty, duty, and fear of divine retribution. But beneath this emphasis lies an acknowledgement that authority now depends on compliance rather than presence. Compliance is different from reverence. Reverence arises from belief and trust. Compliance arises from fear and consequence. Fear-based authority is effective, but it is brittle. It must be renewed constantly. It must be reinforced through spectacle and punishment. The gods themselves seem aware of this brittleness. They issue warnings repeatedly. They remind humans of past destructions. They recount floods, famines, and defeats as cautionary tales. Memory becomes a tool of enforcement. The repetition of catastrophe serves a dual purpose. It preserves the mythic past and reinforces present authority. Remember what happens when humans overstep. Remember the flood. Remember the wrath. Remember the silence that followed. But repetition also dulls impact. A threat repeated too often becomes background noise. As reverence fades, humans learn to live with enforcement. They adapt. They comply outwardly while navigating the system pragmatically. Ritual becomes routine. Offerings become obligations. Worship becomes scheduled rather than spontaneous. This routinization marks a profound change. The divine-human relationship is no longer relational. It is contractual. Contracts imply mutual obligation, but they also imply limits. They can be fulfilled minimally. They can be exploited. They can be renegotiated. The gods respond to this contractual reality by tightening control. They specify rituals in detail. They prescribe exact offerings. They punish deviation. Yet the more detailed the requirements become, the more evident it is that authority is under strain. A system at peace does not require constant specification. Another sign of enforcement replacing reverence appears in how silence is treated. Earlier texts assume silence as a natural condition of divine order. Later texts attempt to impose silence through destruction. Cities are destroyed not because they are immoral, but because they are loud. Silence becomes an enforced state rather than a given. This is telling. Authority that must destroy to regain quiet has lost its ability to inspire restraint. Even the gods' own behaviour reflects this shift. They argue, they disagree, they circumvent each other's decisions. Authority within the divine realm is not absolute, and this internal inconsistency undermines external enforcement. Humans, observing this inconsistency through myth and ritual, learn that authority is not monolithic. It can be appealed to, it can be divided, it can be negotiated. Patronage replaces submission. Humans align with particular gods. Cities choose protectors. Loyalty becomes selective. Enforcement becomes uneven. Uneven enforcement weakens authority further. As centuries pass, divine punishment becomes less catastrophic and more symbolic. Omens warn of disaster rather than disaster itself. Dreams threaten consequences that may or may not arrive. Interpretation becomes key. Interpretation empowers humans. Priests gain influence by controlling interpretation. Kings gain influence by claiming correct alignment. The gods recede further into abstraction. This abstraction requires even more enforcement to maintain relevance. Without presence, authority must rely on fear of the unseen. This fear is cultivated through story, ritual, and memory, yet memory itself changes. Writing preserves myths, but it also allows them to be analysed, compared, and questioned. Texts exist side by side, contradictions are visible, authority becomes complex rather than singular. Complex authority is harder to enforce. The gods respond by emphasising fate. Destiny becomes fixed. Human effort is limited, submission is encouraged, but fate itself becomes a subject of debate. Can it be altered? Can it be appealed? Can it be delayed? The very existence of these questions signals erosion. Reverence has become conditional. Authority has become procedural. Enforcement has become necessary. This does not mean that humans cease to believe. Belief persists, but belief no longer guarantees obedience. It must be supported by consequence. The gods are still feared, but fear alone cannot sustain the kind of presence they once enjoyed. Fear keeps distance. Reverence invites closeness. As authority shifts toward enforcement, closeness disappears. The gods become remote figures, invoked at moments of crisis rather than lived with daily. Their names carry weight, but their presence does not shape routine existence in the same way. Human institutions fill the gap. Law replaces divine decree. Custom replaces command. Memory replaces encounter. This transition is not celebrated in the texts. It is not condemned either. It is simply recorded. Authority that needed enforcement instead of reverence is authority that has entered its final stable form. It no longer expands, it maintains. Maintenance is quieter than creation. It is less visible. It is less inspiring. From this point forward, the gods are still rulers, but they rule through systems rather than presence. They enforce rather than inspire. They correct rather than create. This is not collapse. It is contraction, and contraction carries consequences. As enforcement replaces reverence, the divine-human relationship becomes increasingly rigid. Rigid systems resist change, but they also fracture under pressure. Humanity continues to grow, adapt, and persist within these constraints. The gods remain, but their authority must work harder to be felt. The strain does not resolve. It deepens, setting the stage for punishment, resistance, and eventual withdrawal, not as a dramatic end, but as an administrative necessity in a world that no longer responds to reverence alone. There is a moment in the ancient record where the tone shifts in a way that is both subtle and deeply revealing. The gods, who once issued commands without explanation and shaped the world through decisive acts, begin to voice dissatisfaction, not with enemies, not with rival powers, but with their own creation. Humanity, formed to solve a problem, is now described as creating one. This change is not dramatic. It does not appear as a single declaration or a sudden reversal of divine intention. It unfolds gradually, through repeated complaints, through murmurs in divine assemblies, through phrases that express irritation rather than authority. The gods do not curse humanity outright. They grumble about it. Complaint is a powerful signal. It suggests expectation unmet. It suggests fatigue. It suggests that the relationship between creator and creation has shifted from control to management, and from management to frustration. In the earliest accounts, the gods are decisive. They act, they order, they separate heaven and earth, they assign roles, they create systems and expect those systems to function. Humanity, introduced later, fits into this structure neatly. Humans work, gods rest. Balance is restored. But balance does not remain static. Humanity multiplies. Work increases. The scale of activity expands beyond what was originally envisioned. Cities emerge not as isolated centres, but as continuous zones of habitation and labour. The land becomes organised, irrigated, structured, and the gods notice. The texts describe a world filled with sound. This sound is not symbolic. It is described in practical terms. Human activity produces noise that rises upward. It reaches the divine realm. It interferes with rest. The gods cannot sleep. This detail is repeated often enough that it cannot be dismissed as poetic embellishment. Sleep in these texts is not incidental. It represents limitation. A being that must sleep is a being that can be disturbed. A being that can be disturbed is not fully insulated from the world it governs. The gods begin to speak of humanity not as a blessing, but as an inconvenience. This is a remarkable reversal. Humans were created to relieve divine labour. Now they are described as creating a new burden. The complaint is not that humans are lazy. It is not that they are disobedient. It is not even that they are impious. It is that they are numerous, active, and present. Presence itself becomes the problem. This reveals something crucial about the nature of divine authority in these texts. The gods are not distant observers. They are embedded in the same system they oversee. They share the same environment. When that environment changes, they are affected. The gods complain because they are tired, because they are irritated, because the world has become louder than they can tolerate. This is not the language of omnipotence. It is the language of administrators managing an overloaded system. The complaints escalate. Divine assemblies are convened. The gods discuss the problem of humanity not in moral terms but in logistical ones. Too many people, too much noise, too much disruption. The solution proposed is not reform, it is reduction. This is where the flood enters the narrative, not as divine wrath in response to sin, but as a practical response to irritation. Silence is the goal, rest is the objective. The gods do not debate whether humanity deserves destruction, they debate how to achieve quiet. This is a chilling detail. It reframes one of the most famous stories in ancient literature as an administrative decision, rather than a moral judgment. Humanity is not destroyed because it has failed ethically. It is destroyed because it has succeeded too thoroughly. Yet even here, the complaints do not end the problem. Humanity survives. A remnant remains. Labour resumes. Cities are rebuilt. Noise returns. The gods respond with further measures. Lifespans are shortened. Mortality becomes fixed. Suffering increases. These changes are described not as temporary punishments, but as permanent conditions. These conditions serve a purpose. They limit accumulation. They reduce overlap between generations. They prevent density from reaching the same levels as before, but the complaints continue. The gods now complain not only about noise, but about responsibility. Humanity depends on them for order, yet burdens them with its presence. The gods are expected to provide fertility, protection, and stability, but the cost of doing so grows heavier. This tension reveals a fundamental flaw in the original arrangement. Humanity was created to solve a problem, but the solution scaled beyond control. The gods did not anticipate permanence. In the earliest conception, humanity appears almost as a workforce that can be adjusted or replaced. Over time, humanity becomes something else, a continuous presence, a self-replicating system, a population that cannot simply be turned off without collapsing the very structure it supports. The gods find themselves trapped by their own creation. This entrapment is reflected in the tone of the complaints. The gods do not express hatred. They express weariness. They are annoyed. They are tired of managing consequences. In later texts, this weariness deepens. The gods are portrayed as reluctant to intervene. They delegate. They rely on intermediaries. They withdraw from direct involvement whenever possible. Complaint becomes a substitute for action. This is significant. A god who complains rather than acts is a god whose authority is no longer effortless. Action has consequences. Intervention creates new problems. Silence becomes preferable. The gods begin to tolerate conditions they once sought to eliminate. Noise persists. humanity grows, the world remains active. Rather than resetting it again, the gods impose limits and step back. This step back is often interpreted as transcendence, but the text suggests something closer to resignation. The gods complain because they cannot fully resolve the problem humanity represents without destroying the system entirely. They accept imperfection as the cost of continuity. This acceptance marks a turning point. Once the gods accept that humanity cannot be reduced beyond a certain point, they begin to adjust their role. They become less present, less involved, less reactive. Complaint replaces command. This change affects how humans perceive the divine. Gods who complain are gods who reveal vulnerability. Vulnerability does not inspire the same reverence as absolute authority. It invites negotiation. Humans begin to appeal to gods differently. They bargain, they plead, they attempt to mitigate divine irritation rather than simply obey commands. Ritual becomes a way to manage divine mood. Offerings are no longer just acts of devotion. They are appeasements, attempts to quiet divine dissatisfaction. Sacrifice becomes transactional. This transactional relationship deepens the distance. The gods are no longer partners in the world's operation. They are stakeholders whose tolerance must be maintained. As complaints accumulate, the gods' presence becomes increasingly symbolic. They are invoked in prayers and rituals, but their direct involvement in daily life diminishes. The world continues to function. Agriculture persists, cities expand, law codes are written, administration develops. Humanity adapts to divine withdrawal. The gods complain, but they no longer intervene as frequently. Their frustration does not lead to decisive action. It leads to distance. This distance reshapes everything. A god who complains without resolving the source of irritation is acknowledging a limit. That limit is not power, it is compatibility. Humanity and the gods no longer fit comfortably within the same space. The complaints, recorded across generations of texts, are echoes of this incompatibility. They mark the slow recognition that the world has changed in ways the gods did not fully anticipate. The creation has outgrown its original function. This does not mean the gods are defeated. It means they are displaced. They retreat into abstraction, into fate, into judgment, into the underworld. They become arbiters rather than overseers. Their complaints fade from the record, not because the problem is solved, but because they have chosen not to remain close enough to be disturbed by it. From this point forward, the gods are present primarily when something goes wrong. Disaster, omen, crisis. Daily life belongs to humanity. The moment the gods begin complaining about their creation is the moment they begin to lose their centrality. Complaint is the first sign of withdrawal. It is the acknowledgement that authority no longer flows effortlessly from presence. The system has become too loud, too dense, too alive, and so the gods step back, not in defeat, but in response to a world that no longer allows them rest. This withdrawal does not happen all at once. It unfolds slowly, through frustration, through delegation, through silence. The complaints are the record of that process. From here, the narrative continues toward punishment and control, not as expressions of strength, but as attempts to manage a relationship that no longer operates on obedience alone. And as the gods complain, humanity continues, largely unaware that endurance itself has become its most transformative act. Punishment enters the record not as a first response, but as a substitute for something that no longer works. It appears only after reverence weakens, after complaint fails, after authority must be asserted rather than assumed. In the ancient texts, punishment is never presented as the original mechanism of order. It emerges when the older mechanisms lose their effectiveness. This distinction matters. A system built on reverence relies on shared alignment. A system built on punishment relies on fear. The moment punishment becomes necessary, the relationship has already shifted. In the earliest layers of the tradition, the The gods do not punish humanity frequently or systematically. They create, they organize, they assign roles. Humans comply because compliance makes sense within the structure of the world as it exists. The gods are close. Their presence is felt. Their power is immediate. Punishment is not needed when consequence is visible and authority is embedded in daily life. As distance grows, punishment becomes a way to compensate for absence. The texts never describe humanity openly rebelling against the gods. There is no organized resistance, no declaration of independence, no attempt to overthrow divine rule. Resistance instead takes a quieter form. It is expressed through persistence, through adaptation, through continuing activity in spite of divine irritation. Humans keep building, they keep multiplying, they keep living. This persistence becomes indistinguishable from resistance in the eyes of the gods. When authority depends on compliance, non-compliance can be punished. But when authority depends on silence, presence itself becomes defiance. The gods interpret human continuity as resistance, not because humans challenge commands, but because they refuse to diminish. Punishment, then, is directed not at behaviour, but at scale. The flood is the clearest example. It is often described as divine punishment, but the texts themselves do not frame it in moral terms. Humanity is not accused of corruption or immorality in the earliest versions. It is accused of being too numerous, too loud, too active. This is not resistance in the modern sense. It is incompatibility. Punishment becomes the tool used to restore compatibility by force. The language surrounding the flood reflects this logic. The gods do not say humanity must be corrected. They say humanity must be reduced. Silence must be restored. Rest must be regained. Punishment is not corrective. It is suppressive. This sets a precedent. After the flood, punishment becomes embedded in the structure of existence, rather than applied only in exceptional moments. Mortality is fixed. Lifespans are shortened. Disease becomes a regular presence. These are not episodic punishments. They are conditions. Conditions are more effective than interventions. They require no ongoing decision. They operate continuously. They do not depend on divine presence. This shift marks a crucial transition. The gods move from reacting to resistance to preventing it structurally. Resistance, in this context, does not mean refusal to worship. It means the capacity to grow beyond control. Punishment becomes a way to limit potential rather than correct action. The texts are explicit about this in subtle ways. Human suffering is normalized. Infant mortality is accepted as part of the order of things. Barrenness is decreed. Predation is permitted. These are not described as tragedies requiring explanation. They are described as features of the world. Features do not invite appeal. They must be endured. Punishment becomes impersonal. This impersonalization is significant. A punishment delivered directly by a god can be negotiated. It can be appealed. It can be mitigated. A punishment embedded in the fabric of existence cannot. By making punishment structural, the gods remove themselves from constant enforcement. Distance increases. Responsibility shifts downward. Yet this strategy reveals its own limitations. Humans adapt to conditions. They learn to live with mortality. They develop rituals to cope with loss. They create social structures to manage suffering. Punishment does not halt human continuity. It reshapes it. This adaptation is another form of resistance, though it is never named as such. Humanity does not rebel against mortality. It builds meaning around it. It creates legacy. It preserves memory. Memory is particularly threatening to systems of punishment. Punishment relies on fear of consequence. Memory allows consequence to be contextualized. It allows patterns to be recognized. It allows humans to see that punishment is not always proportional, not always consistent, not always avoidable. As punishment becomes more frequent in the texts, it also becomes more predictable. Floods, famines, plagues, defeat in war. These events are interpreted as divine responses to disorder, but they follow recognizable patterns. They coincide with overpopulation, political instability, environmental stress. This predictability undermines their effectiveness as tools of absolute authority. What can be anticipated can be prepared for. What can be prepared for loses its power to terrify. The gods respond by emphasizing unpredictability. Omens become ambiguous. Signs require interpretation. Dreams convey warnings without clarity. Punishment becomes conditional rather than certain. Conditional punishment requires intermediaries. Priests interpret signs. Kings declare responses. Human institutions manage divine displeasure. The gods become less directly involved in punishment, even as punishment remains central to maintaining order. This delegation further distances divine authority from daily life. Punishment is experienced as fate rather than decision. Suffering is accepted rather than questioned. Yet the texts preserve moments where punishment is contested, even if only indirectly. Enki's actions during the flood narrative are the clearest example. He undermines the ultimate punishment. He preserves life against decree. This establishes a precedent that punishment is not always final. Finality is essential for absolute authority. Once punishment can be circumvented, authority weakens. Humans learn from these stories. They learn that gods can disagree, that decrees can be worked around, that survival is sometimes possible even when punishment is announced. This knowledge changes how punishment is perceived. It becomes something to be managed rather than feared absolutely. The underworld narratives reinforce this perception. Death itself is structured. It is governed. It has rules. It is not annihilation. It is administration. Administration implies order. Order implies predictability. Punishment, once embedded in an ordered system, loses its character as an expression of divine will and becomes a function of the system itself. At this point, resistance no longer takes the form of defiance. It takes the form of navigation. Humans learn how to live within constraints, how to avoid extremes, how to appease gods sufficiently to avoid catastrophe without aspiring to closeness. This is a diminished relationship, but a stable one. The gods, meanwhile, appear increasingly reluctant to impose large-scale punishment again. The flood is not repeated. Catastrophes become localized. Control becomes fragmented. This restraint suggests recognition of limits. Total destruction threatens the system the gods rely on. Punishment must be calibrated. Calibration requires distance, observation, and restraint. It is no longer instinctive. The texts reflect this by shifting focus from punishment to warning. Omens proliferate. Prophecies warn of consequences. Punishment is delayed rather than immediate. Delay invites negotiation. Humans respond by increasing ritual precision. They seek to avoid punishment rather than restore reverence. Worship becomes defensive. Defensive worship is different from devotion. It is cautious, minimal, strategic. This strategy works. The gods receive offerings. Order is maintained. Punishment is avoided most of the time, but the cost is intimacy. The gods are no longer central figures in human imagination. They are distant powers whose moods must be managed. They are not companions. They are not guides. Punishment as a response to resistance thus marks a turning point. It signals that authority has shifted from relational to coercive. It reveals that the gods are no longer able to rely on reverence to maintain order. Resistance, in its quiet form, has succeeded. Humanity has not overthrown the gods. It has outlasted the conditions under which reverence functioned naturally. Punishment becomes the final tool of a system struggling to preserve relevance. As punishment becomes normalized, it loses its dramatic force. It becomes background reality. Humans grow accustomed to suffering. They build culture around it. They create meaning in spite of it. Meaning does not require divine proximity. From here, the narrative moves towards something even more telling. Punishment gives way to withdrawal. Control becomes symbolic. Presence fades. The gods will continue to punish when necessary, but necessity becomes rare. Intervention becomes exceptional. What remains is a world that functions largely on its own, carrying the weight of divine rules long after divine voices have grown faint. Punishment did not restore obedience. It preserved distance, and distance, once established, reshapes everything that follows. The flood has long been treated as a moral story, a dramatic lesson about divine justice and human failure. But when the earliest versions are read slowly and without later theological assumptions imposed upon them, a different picture begins to emerge. The language does not centre on corruption, sin, or ethical collapse. It centres on scale, on density, on disturbance, on a world that has become too active for the system that governs it. When viewed this way, the flood reads less like punishment in the moral sense and more like suppression. Not the correction of wrongdoing, but the reduction of pressure. In the oldest Mesopotamian accounts, the decision to send the flood follows a period of sustained complaint. The gods do not deliberate over guilt, they deliberate over noise. Human activity has reached a level that interferes with divine rest. The gods cannot sleep. The world has become intolerably loud. This detail is not incidental. It is repeated across versions because it explains motivation. Suppression is always motivated by perceived threat, not necessarily hostility, but destabilization. The flood is framed as a way to restore a previous equilibrium, one in which the gods could exist without constant disturbance. Silence is the desired outcome. The destruction of humanity is the method. This distinction matters because it reframes the entire event. A punishment seeks to correct behaviour so that it does not recur. Suppression seeks to eliminate the source of pressure entirely, regardless of cause. The flood is not intended to reform humanity. It is intended to quiet it. The gods do not issue warnings to humanity at large. They do not demand repentance. They do not offer conditions under which the catastrophe could be avoided. These omissions are significant. They suggest that human behaviour as such is not the issue. Human existence at scale is. The suppression logic becomes even clearer when one considers what survives the flood. Humanity is not erased completely. A controlled remnant is preserved, not because of mercy in the moral sense, but because total elimination would create new problems. The gods still require labour. The system cannot function without humans at all. This is not justice, it is management. The preservation of a single family, warned in secret and instructed to build a vessel, reveals the true intent of the flood. It is not annihilation, it is reduction. Humanity is to be scaled back to a level the gods find tolerable. This logic aligns precisely with what follows after the waters recede. Lifespans are shortened, mortality is fixed. Population growth is constrained through suffering. These measures serve the same purpose as the flood, but in a less dramatic, more sustainable way. The flood, then, is not an isolated event. It is the most extreme instance of a broader strategy. When suppression is necessary, it indicates that other forms of control have failed. Reverence no longer maintains order. Complaint no longer resolves irritation. Punishment alone is insufficient because the underlying problem persists. Humanity continues to grow, adapt, and fill the world. Suppression is a last resort. The texts themselves treat the flood as a boundary rather than an ending. Time is divided into before and after. The world that existed prior to the flood is described as fundamentally different from the one that follows. Kings rule for impossible lengths of time. The boundary between divine and human is thin. Interaction is frequent. After the flood, everything changes. Lifespans collapse. Divine presence recedes. The world becomes harsher. The relationship becomes distant. This suggests that the flood is not merely a reaction to a temporary crisis, but a restructuring of the system itself. The old world was unsustainable. The new world is designed to prevent the same pressures from arising again. Suppression reshapes reality. One of the most revealing details in the flood narratives is the reaction of the gods themselves once the event is underway. They are not portrayed as triumphant. They're frightened. They panic. They cluster together like flies, according to one vivid description, terrified by the scale of destruction they have unleashed. This detail undermines any reading of the flood as confident divine justice. The gods do not control the event with calm authority. They endure it. They regret it. They experience fear. Fear suggests loss of control. If the flood were purely punitive, the gods would not be disturbed by its effects. They would stand apart from it. Instead, they are affected by it. The world they have destroyed is also the world they inhabit. This reinforces the interpretation of the flood as suppression rather than judgment. It is an emergency measure, not an expression of moral clarity. The aftermath confirms this. The gods immediately regret the loss of offerings. Humanity's absence creates a new crisis. Without humans, the gods starve. They depend on sacrifices for sustenance. The system they attempted to quiet has also been sustaining them. Suppression has consequences. This realization forces a compromise. Humanity must exist, but in a diminished form. Close proximity must be avoided. Constant interaction must end. The gods cannot live among humans indefinitely without being disturbed, but they also cannot exist without them. The solution is distance. Distance is enforced through structural changes rather than repeated catastrophes. Mortality ensures turnover. Suffering limits expansion. Ritual replaces presence. Temples replace landscapes as sites of divine contact. The flood becomes the justification for these changes. It serves as a memory of what happens when humanity grows unchecked. It is retold not as a lesson in obedience, but as a warning about excess. Excess, not immorality, is the core concern. When later traditions reinterpret the flood as punishment for sin, they impose a moral framework that is largely absent from the earliest texts. That reinterpretation serves different theological purposes. It emphasizes ethics, obedience, and covenant. But the older record emphasizes scale, noise, and disturbance. This older emphasis aligns with a broader pattern already visible. Humanity is not dangerous because it is evil. It is dangerous because it is persistent. Persistence cannot be punished away. It must be limited structurally. The flood, as a suppression event, marks the moment when the gods recognize this truth. After this moment, divine strategies change. Large-scale destruction becomes rare. Control becomes subtler. Intervention becomes indirect. Omens replace cataclysms. Fate replaces command. This does not mean the gods become kinder. It means they become more cautious. They have learned that overwhelming force destabilizes the system as much as unchecked humanity does. Suppression gives way to regulation. The memory of the flood remains powerful precisely because it represents the maximum extent of divine intervention. It is the outer limit of control. Beyond it lies collapse. Humans remember the flood not as a moment of moral reckoning, but as a moment when the world itself nearly ended. That memory shapes behavior. It instills caution. It encourages compliance without requiring constant enforcement. Memory becomes a tool of suppression. By retelling the flood, the gods no longer need to repeat it. Fear of repetition maintains order, yet even this tool weakens over time. As generations pass, the flood becomes mythic rather than immediate. Its emotional force fades. Humanity continues to grow within the new constraints. The gods respond not with another flood, but with further withdrawal. Withdrawal is the final form of suppression. Rather than reducing humanity again, the gods reduce themselves. They retreat into abstraction, into judgment, into fate. They remove their presence from daily life so that human noise can no longer disturb them. This is not defeat in the conventional sense. It is a strategic retreat. The flood, reconsidered this way, is not the climax of divine power. It is the beginning of divine distance. It marks the recognition that proximity is unsustainable. From this point onward, the gods no longer attempt to live within the world they govern. They rule from afar. They intervene selectively. They observe rather than participate. Humanity, meanwhile, inherits the world that remains, scarred, limited, mortal, but functional. Suppression has achieved its goal. The system stabilizes. Yet stabilization comes at a cost. The intimacy between gods and humans is gone. What remains is authority without presence, memory without encounter, ritual without companionship. The flood stands as the last moment when the gods attempted to resolve the problem of humanity through force. Everything that follows is quieter. And this quiet is not peace. It is separation. From here, the narrative moves forward into the aftermath of survival, into memory, resentment, and adaptation, as humanity carries forward under constraints designed to prevent it from ever becoming too loud again. What survives a catastrophe is never neutral. Survival carries memory, and memory reshapes relationships long after the event itself has passed. The flood does not end the story, it reorganizes it. When the waters recede and the world re-emerges, what remains is not a return to balance, but a fragile continuation marked by awareness. Humanity knows now, even if only dimly, that it can be erased. And the gods know that erasure comes at a cost they cannot fully afford. The survivors do not emerge into a restored world. They emerge into a diminished one. The texts make this clear without dwelling on spectacle. The land is changed. The social order is altered. Lifespans are reduced. The ease of existence that characterized the antediluvian age is gone. Survival continues, but it does so under new terms. Memory becomes the most powerful inheritance of the catastrophe. Not memory in the sense of historical record alone, but memory embedded in myth, ritual, and expectation. Humanity remembers that the gods chose silence over coexistence. That knowledge does not disappear simply because the world continues. The survivors respond first with obedience. Sacrifices are made immediately. Gratitude is expressed. Appeasement is offered. This behavior is not surprising. In a world where survival feels provisional, reverence intensifies. The gods are thanked not because they are just, but because they are powerful. Yet gratitude does not erase understanding. The texts preserve the fact that the flood was not sent because humanity was corrupt, but because it was disruptive. This distinction lingers beneath the surface of ritual. Humans may not articulate it openly, but the narrative itself preserves it. Resentment does not appear as open accusation. It appears as quiet recalibration. After the catastrophe, the relationship between humans and gods becomes more cautious. Humans do not seek closeness. They seek safety. They do not aspire to divine intimacy. They aspire to avoid divine attention. This shift is subtle but profound. Worship becomes defensive rather than celebratory. Rituals are performed to prevent disaster, not to cultivate presence. The gods are honoured, so they will remain distant. Distance becomes a form of protection. The survivors pass this orientation down through generations. Children grow up in a world where divine destruction is part of inherited memory. Even if the details blur, the emotional residue remains. The gods are capable of wiping the world clean. That possibility never fully fades. At the same time, the gods themselves adjust their behaviour. They regret aspects of the catastrophe. They recognize that the absence of humanity deprives them of offerings. This mutual dependency becomes explicit after the flood. The gods need humans. Humans fear the gods. Fear and need do not produce harmony. They produce negotiation. The texts reflect this negotiation through changing emphasis. The gods no longer dwell openly among humans. They accept offerings from a distance. Temples replace landscapes as points of contact. Ritual replaces encounter. For humans, this distance is both relief and loss. Relief because divine presence is unpredictable and dangerous. Loss because divine guidance is no longer immediate. Into this gap steps memory. Memory becomes humanity's primary connection to the divine. Stories are told. Flood narratives are preserved. Warnings are encoded in myth. The past becomes instruction. Instruction does not require presence. It requires repetition. As generations pass, memory is shaped by experience. Each famine, each plague, each disaster is interpreted through the lens of the flood. The catastrophe becomes a template. Suffering is no longer surprising. It is expected. This expectation changes how humans understand the gods. They are no longer benevolent creators who guide existence. They are volatile powers who must be managed. Management is different from reverence. Humans learn to live within limits. Lifespans are shorter. Death is normalized. Loss becomes routine. Communities develop customs to cope with grief, rather than expecting divine intervention to prevent it. This coping is not rebellion. It is adaptation. Adaptation, however, carries consequences for authority. A god whose followers can endure without constant reassurance loses a certain kind of power. Dependency decreases. Resilience increases. The texts do not describe humans celebrating this resilience. They describe it matter-of-factly. Life continues. Cities are rebuilt. Kings rule. Agriculture resumes. Yet something has shifted permanently. The world is no longer experienced as a shared space between gods and humans. It is a human space overseen from a distance. This distance breeds a quiet form of resentment, not hatred, not defiance, but awareness. Humans know that the gods chose destruction over accommodation. That knowledge is never fully erased, even when ritual affirms loyalty. It exists beneath the surface of devotion. Resentment expresses itself indirectly, in stories where humans seek immortality and are denied, in laments about the brevity of life, in questions about fate and fairness. These narratives do not accuse the gods openly, but they explore the consequences of divine decisions. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one such exploration. A king who survives in a post-flood world confronts mortality directly. He learns that eternal life was once possible, but is no longer accessible. He learns that the gods have closed that door. This realization does not lead to revolt. It leads to resignation. Resignation is powerful. It stabilizes society. It prevents open conflict. But it also freezes the relationship. Humans stop expecting transformation. They expect maintenance. Maintenance does not inspire awe. It sustains routine. The gods become custodians of order rather than sources of wonder. They ensure cycles continue. They guarantee seasons. They maintain boundaries. Boundaries are crucial after the catastrophe. The boundary between divine and human is reinforced repeatedly. Crossing it becomes dangerous. Stories warn against proximity. Those who approach too closely suffer consequences. This reinforces separation. Over time, resentment fades into distance. The initial emotional response to catastrophe dulls. Memory remains, but its intensity decreases. The flood becomes myth rather than trauma. Yet even as it becomes myth, it continues to shape behavior. It justifies restraint. It explains limitation. It normalizes suffering. The gods no longer need to threaten destruction explicitly. The memory of destruction does that work for them. This is a more efficient form of control. For humanity, this efficiency has an unintended side effect. The gods recede further. Their presence becomes symbolic. Their voices are heard through tradition rather than experience. Human institutions grow stronger in response. Law codes replace divine decrees. Administration replaces revelation. Writing preserves memory without divine involvement. The survivors of the catastrophe and their descendants do not overthrow the gods. They outgrow the need for constant divine presence. Resentment in this context is not anger. It is acceptance of distance. It is the understanding that closeness invites risk. This understanding reshapes worship. Offerings are made precisely. Rituals are followed carefully. Innovation in religious practice slows. Stability becomes the goal. Stability benefits human society, but it also locks the divine into a fixed role. The gods become guarantors of continuity rather than participants in change. Once fixed, they are easier to remember than to encounter. The aftermath of the flood thus creates a world where both sides retreat slightly. Humans retreat from expectation. Gods retreat from proximity. Between them lies memory. Memory carries warning, not invitation. As generations pass, this memory becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Humanity defines itself not by closeness to the gods, but by endurance under their rules. This endurance is quiet. It does not demand recognition. And it prepares the ground for what follows. Because once humanity learns to survive catastrophe, to carry memory without presence, to adapt without guidance, the gods no longer occupy the centre of daily life. They remain above, beyond, and invoked. But they are no longer necessary for survival itself. From this point onward, the story continues into shortened lifespans, altered biology, and the gradual acceptance of limits that were imposed to prevent humanity from ever becoming too loud again. And within those limits, humanity continues forward, carrying memory, restraint, and a quiet understanding of what happens when the gods decide that coexistence has gone too far. There is a change in the record that is so stark it almost passes unnoticed, because it is never explained. The lifespans simply collapse. Where the earliest figures rule and live for tens of thousands of years, where time stretches outward in ways that feel unbound and unreal, later generations are suddenly confined to decades, not gradually, not symbolically, abruptly. And the texts offer no moral justification, no narrative reasoning, no explicit cause. The reduction is stated as fact, not as consequence. This silence is important. Ancient texts are rarely silent about punishment when punishment is intended to teach a lesson. When divine anger is meant to instruct, it is described clearly. When wrongdoing is punished, the wrongdoing is named. But here, there is no accusation, no transgression listed, no moment where a god declares that humanity must now live shorter lives because of some specific failure. The lifespans shorten, and the narrative moves on. This absence of explanation has led many later traditions to fill the gap with theology, ethics, or symbolism. But when we stay with the earliest material itself, a different picture begins to form. Lifespan reduction appears not as judgment, but as policy. Before the flood boundary, time behaves differently. The antediluvian rulers exist in a world that is closer to the gods, not only spiritually but structurally. Their reigns stretch across vast spans not because they are better humans, but because the system they inhabit allows it. The boundary between divine and human is thin. Mortality is not yet fixed. Existence is flexible. After the catastrophe, that flexibility disappears. The world that follows the flood is more rigid, more regulated, more controlled. The reduction of lifespan functions like a structural adjustment rather than a moral one. It limits accumulation. It prevents continuity across too many generations. It ensures turnover. Turnover is crucial for control. A long-lived population accumulates memory too deeply. It remembers conditions before restriction. It carries living knowledge of alternative arrangements. It preserves expectations that no longer fit the redesigned world. Shorter lifespans erase that continuity. When humans live only a few decades, memory fragments. Knowledge must be passed deliberately rather than embodied. The past becomes story instead of experience. This weakens comparison. It limits the ability to say, "It was once different." The texts never state this outright, but their structure reflects it. After the flood, genealogy becomes compressed. Generations move quickly. Kings rise and fall within manageable spans. History becomes something that can be recorded rather than remembered directly. Recording is safer than remembering. A population that remembers the old world through lived experience might question why it ended. A population that knows it only through myth accepts it as inevitable. Shortened lifespans also reduce proximity between humans and gods. In the earlier world, figures who lived for millennia could interact with divine beings repeatedly, over long stretches of time. Relationships could form. Familiarity could develop. Familiarity erodes distance. By limiting human lifespan, the gods limit the depth of relationship possible between mortals and the divine. Each human life becomes too brief to approach divine time. The gap widens naturally. This also changes how authority is perceived. A god who endures across countless generations appears stable, inevitable, unchanging. A human who lives briefly accepts that imbalance as natural. The asymmetry becomes built into biology. The texts do not describe the gods announcing this change. There is no scene of decree, no divine assembly explaining the necessity of mortality. The reduction simply appears as the new condition of existence. This suggests that the change was not meant to be negotiated. Negotiable rules are explained. Structural conditions are imposed. Mortality becomes one of those conditions. It is not framed as punishment. It is framed as reality. This framing matters because punishment invites appeal. Reality does not. Humans plead against famine. They pray against disease. They do not pray against mortality itself. It is accepted. It becomes the boundary condition of life. By embedding limitation into existence, the gods remove the need for constant intervention. They no longer need to suppress population growth through repeated catastrophes. Time itself does the work. Short lives mean fewer people alive at any given moment. They mean reduced noise, reduced density, reduced pressure. This aligns perfectly with the earlier divine complaints. The problem was not human behaviour. It was human scale. Scale is most efficiently managed through time. The texts quietly reflect this efficiency. After the flood, divine punishment becomes less spectacular. No second global catastrophe occurs. Control is maintained through ordinary suffering rather than extraordinary destruction. Ordinary suffering is sustainable. Extraordinary destruction destabilizes the system. Shortened lifespans also reshape ambition. A being that lives thousands of years can undertake projects that span eras. It can challenge structures. It can wait out authority. A being that lives only a few decades must prioritize survival, family, continuity. It has little time to challenge cosmic arrangements. This does not mean humans become passive. It means resistance changes form. Instead of seeking immortality directly, humans seek legacy. Instead of challenging gods openly, they build institutions. Instead of confronting fate, they endure it. Endurance is quieter than defiance. The Epic of Gilgamesh captures this shift precisely. The hero lives in a post-flood world. He knows that eternal life once existed. He knows that it is now inaccessible. He seeks it anyway, not out of rebellion but out of grief. When he fails, the lesson is not obedience. It is acceptance. Acceptance stabilizes the system. The gods do not need to argue with Gilgamesh. They do not need to punish him. They simply deny him access. The world he inhabits no longer allows such exceptions. This is the power of structural control. The absence of explanation in the text may be intentional. To explain mortality is to invite debate. To justify it is to acknowledge that it could have been otherwise. By offering no explanation, the text presents shortened lifespans as a given, as something beyond question. Humans are not told why they must die. They are told that they do. This removes the issue from the realm of ethics and places it in the realm of ontology. It is not about deserving. It is about being. The gods themselves appear to accept this arrangement as necessary. They do not mourn the loss of long-lived humans. They do not attempt to restore the earlier conditions. The world moves forward under the new rules, and importantly, the gods retreat further after this change. Once lifespan limitation is in place, there is less need for direct oversight. The system regulates itself. Humanity becomes manageable. This manageability allows the gods to withdraw, without fear that humans will again become too numerous, too loud, too present. Mortality ensures that no generation accumulates enough power or memory to destabilize the order. Memory still exists, but it becomes cultural rather than embodied. Culture can be shaped. Embodied memory is harder to erase. The shortening of lifespans thus serves multiple functions simultaneously. It reduces scale. It limits familiarity. It stabilizes authority. It enables divine distance. And yet, the texts never celebrate this change. There is no hymn praising mortality. There is no declaration that the new order is better. The silence is telling. Mortality is not presented as a gift. It is presented as a condition. Humans respond by building meaning around it. Rituals emerge to cope with death. Stories explore its inevitability. Philosophy arises from its presence. This intellectual and cultural development further reduces dependence on direct divine presence. Humans find ways to live fully within limits, rather than seeking to escape them. This adaptation is not rebellion, but it is independence. Independence does not threaten divine authority directly, but it renders constant intervention unnecessary. The gods remain powerful, but they are no longer required to manage daily existence. Their role becomes abstract. They govern fate rather than life. Fate is impersonal. It does not require conversation. The shortening of lifespans without explanation thus marks a decisive moment in the reconfiguration of the world. It is the point at which control moves from event to structure, from punishment to condition, from presence to design. The texts move on because the change has done its work. From this point forward, humanity exists within a bounded temporal frame. It adapts to it. It builds within it. It suffers within it. The gods, having imposed this frame, no longer need to complain as loudly. The noise problem diminishes. The scale problem stabilizes. Distance becomes sustainable. And as distance becomes normal, the divine-human relationship transforms again, moving toward withdrawal, delegation, and silence. Not because the gods are gone, but because the system no longer requires their closeness to function. The shortening of lifespans is not an ending. It is a mechanism. And once mechanisms replace intervention, the story of the gods enters a quieter phase, one where presence fades and authority becomes something remembered rather than experienced. From here, the narrative continues into withdrawal, disappearance, and the slow redefinition of divinity itself in a world shaped by limits that no longer need to be explained. The withdrawal does not arrive as a single decision or a dramatic departure. It unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly across generations. There is no announcement, no proclamation from the heavens declaring that the gods will no longer walk among humans. Instead, what the texts preserve is a thinning, a reduction in frequency, a subtle shift in where divine presence is expected to be found. In the earliest narratives, the gods are woven directly into daily existence. They move through the world. They speak openly. They intervene in practical matters. They argue with one another in ways humans can witness and understand. The boundary between divine and human is present, but it is permeable. After the flood boundary and the restructuring of existence that follows, this permeability begins to close. The gods are still there, but they are no longer everywhere. The first sign of withdrawal is not silence, but mediation. Divine messages no longer arrive through direct encounter. They arrive through dreams, through omens, through signs that require interpretation. The god no longer stands before the human. Instead, the human must learn how to read what the god has left behind. This change shifts responsibility. Interpretation becomes necessary. Meaning must be extracted rather than received. Once interpretation enters the relationship, certainty disappears. Dreams are ambiguous, omens are conditional, signs can be misread. This ambiguity creates space for human judgment, and with it, human error. Divine will is no longer obvious. It must be inferred. Inference requires specialists. Priests rise in importance not because the gods are more present, but because they are less so. Someone must translate absence into guidance. Someone must speak on behalf of voices that no longer speak directly. The temple becomes the primary site of divine contact, but even there, the god is not always present. The temple houses the god symbolically, ritually, representationally. It is a place prepared for presence, not a guarantee of it. This distinction matters. In earlier periods, the world itself functions as a temple. Rivers, fields, storms, and cities are all domains where gods act openly. As withdrawal progresses, the sacred contracts into architecture. Presence is contained rather than dispersed. Containment is a form of distance. The texts reflect this by shifting emphasis away from divine action in everyday labour. Agriculture continues, irrigation systems are maintained, trade expands, cities grow. These developments are no longer described as requiring constant divine instruction. The gods still receive credit as ultimate patrons, but the mechanisms of daily life operate independently. This independence is not framed as defiance. It is framed as normalcy. Normalcy without divine intervention represents a profound change. The gods respond to this change not with renewed presence, but with delegation. Authority is assigned downward. Kings rule in the name of gods rather than alongside them. Officials administer justice under divine sanction rather than divine supervision. Sanction replaces presence. Once authority functions through sanction, it no longer requires constant reinforcement from above. Human institutions can maintain order on their own, invoking divine approval as needed. The gods become guarantors rather than participants. This guarantor role is quieter. It does not intrude into daily routines. It does not require constant acknowledgement beyond ritual observance. Ritual itself becomes more formalized as withdrawal progresses. The timing of offerings becomes fixed. The words spoken become standardized. Innovation decreases. Standardization suggests distance. When a god is close, worship adapts fluidly. When a god is distant, worship freezes into form. Frozen forms preserve memory but do not invite encounter. The gods appear less often in narratives that describe everyday life. When they do appear, it is usually at moments of crisis, judgment, or boundary crossing. They intervene when order is threatened, not to guide routine existence. This pattern reinforces separation. The divine becomes associated with disruption rather than continuity. Humans begin to associate daily life with human responsibility and divine life with extraordinary moments. The gods become figures of exception rather than presence. This association alters psychology. A god encountered only in crisis is feared rather than known. Fear encourages distance. Distance becomes safety. The texts preserve this safety-seeking behaviour through repeated warnings about proximity. Humans who approach divine realms too closely suffer consequences. Heroes who seek immortality are denied. Mortals who cross boundaries are punished. Boundaries harden as withdrawal continues. Even within myth, the gods become less accessible. They reside in elevated realms. They withdraw to the heavens, the underworld, or distant sacred spaces. The ordinary landscape loses its immediacy as a site of divine interaction. The world becomes human territory. This territorial shift does not eliminate belief. It changes its function. Belief no longer organizes labor. It legitimizes authority. It explains fate. It provides meaning to suffering. Meaning does not require presence. As centuries pass, divine involvement becomes increasingly retrospective. Gods are credited with founding cities, establishing kingship, creating laws. These acts are placed firmly in the past. The present is managed by humans operating within inherited frameworks. The gods are remembered as originators rather than companions. This temporal distancing is another form of withdrawal. When divine action is located primarily in the past, it becomes untouchable, but also irrelevant to immediate decision-making. Humans do not consult origins for daily choices. They consult rules. Rules persist without presence. The gods, in effect, design themselves out of daily necessity. This is not abandonment. It is a strategic retreat enabled by the structural changes already imposed. Shortened lifespans limit accumulation. Mortality enforces turnover. Law codifies behavior. Ritual preserves loyalty. All of these mechanisms allow the gods to step back without losing authority. Authority remains, but it becomes symbolic rather than experiential. Symbols are powerful, but they do not demand attention constantly. They can be acknowledged briefly and then set aside. Humans learn to live this way. They perform rituals at prescribed times. They invoke gods at moments of transition. They do not expect guidance for every decision. Expectation is the key difference. In earlier periods, humans expect gods to act. In later periods, they hope gods will not need to. This hope shapes behavior more effectively than command. The gods appear to accept this arrangement. They intervene selectively. They do not attempt to re-establish constant presence. They do not seek intimacy. Withdrawal becomes mutual. Humans do not seek closeness. Gods do not offer it. Between them lies a stable distance that allows both to exist without constant disturbance. The texts reflect this stability by focusing less on divine-human interaction and more on human affairs. Legal disputes, political conflicts, economic concerns. These narratives unfold without divine interruption. When gods are mentioned, it is often as witnesses rather than actors. Witnesses observe, they do not participate. This observer role further reduces divine involvement. It reinforces the idea that the world can function under supervision rather than control. Supervision is less demanding than management. For the gods, this reduction in demand resolves the original problem. Noise diminishes in relevance. Human activity no longer intrudes into divine rest, because divine rest is no longer located within the same experiential space. Withdrawal solves the incompatibility without requiring further suppression. Yet withdrawal has consequences. Distance erodes familiarity. Familiarity fosters reverence. Reverence weakens without familiarity. What replaces it is obligation. Obligation sustains order, but it does not inspire loyalty in the same way. It maintains structure, not relationship. The gods become remote authorities whose rules must be followed rather than beings whose presence is desired. This shift is not presented as tragedy in the texts, it is presented as adaptation. Adaptation suggests necessity rather than choice. The gods do not withdraw because they are defeated. They withdraw because the world they shaped no longer accommodates them comfortably. Humanity has grown too numerous, too active, too enduring. The structures imposed after the flood make withdrawal sustainable. The gods can now remain distant without losing control. Distance becomes permanence. Over time, this permanence reshapes theology. The gods are conceptualized less as embodied beings and more as principles. Fate, justice, order. These abstractions require no presence. Abstraction is the final stage of withdrawal. Once the gods are abstracted, they cannot be disturbed by noise, they cannot be burdened by labour, they cannot be fatigued, they are safe. Humans, meanwhile, inherit the practical world. They manage it with institutions, laws and memory. They invoke the gods when needed, but they do not expect companionship. Companionship belongs to an earlier age. The gradual withdrawal from daily life thus marks a decisive transformation. The gods cease to be neighbours and become overseers. They cease to be participants and become references. This transformation stabilises the world, but it also marks the end of something intimate. From this point onward, the divine-human relationship is no longer defined by shared space. It is defined by distance maintained through structure. And within that distance, humanity continues, adapting to a world where the gods are no longer part of the everyday rhythm, but shadows at the edges, invoked in moments of fear, gratitude, and transition. The withdrawal is complete not when the gods leave, but when their absence becomes normal. And once absence is normal, presence is no longer expected. From here, the story moves towards silence, disappearance, and the question of whether the gods faded by choice, necessity, or because the world no longer required them to remain close at all. There is a noticeable change in how death is treated in the later texts, and it is one of the most unsettling shifts in the entire record. Death does not disappear. In fact, it becomes more frequent, more visible, more woven into the fabric of existence. Yet the way it is written about changes profoundly. Death is recorded, it is noted, it is described, but it is rarely mourned. This absence of mourning is not because death is insignificant, it is because death has become expected. In the earliest narratives, existence stretches outward. Time feels expansive. Figures live long enough for their deaths to feel exceptional rather than inevitable. When such figures die, their passing carries weight. It marks the end of an era. It invites explanation. It demands meaning. After the flood boundary and the shortening of lifespans, death loses that exceptional quality. It becomes routine. When something is routine, it no longer requires commentary. It no longer disrupts the narrative. It simply occurs. The texts reflect this shift with remarkable restraint. Kings die, and their successors are named. Cities fall, and others rise. Plagues pass through populations, and the record moves on. There is no pause to grieve, no extended lament, no attempt to justify the loss beyond a brief acknowledgement. This change is not accidental. It reflects a world in which death is no longer a divine intervention, but a structural feature. Once mortality is fixed, death ceases to be a message. It becomes background. The gods no longer need to explain death because death is no longer a response to specific human action. It is not punishment. It is not warning. It is simply the way the world functions now. This functionalization of death has profound implications for how humanity understands both itself and the divine. In a world where death is unpredictable and exceptional, gods are active agents. They strike, they spare, they choose. In a world where death is constant and expected, divine agency recedes. Fate replaces decision. Order replaces intervention. The text quietly acknowledged this by shifting emphasis away from divine responsibility for individual deaths. People die because they are mortal, because they age, because disease exists, because the world is dangerous. These causes are impersonal. Impersonal causes do not invite mourning in the same way as personal ones. They invite endurance. Endurance becomes the defining human trait in the post-catastrophe world. The absence of mourning also reflects something else: distance. When gods are close, death is relational. A god takes life. A god spares life. Loss is framed as the result of divine will. Mourning in such a context is a response to relationship. When gods withdraw, death becomes administrative. It is processed. It is recorded. It is accepted. The underworld narratives reinforce this acceptance. Death is not chaos. It is organization. There are gates, judges, procedures, rules. The dead do not vanish. They are sorted. Sorting does not require emotion. The Anunnaki, in their later characterization, preside over this process. They judge. They assign. They determine fate. They do not mourn. They administer. Administration replaces grief. This transformation in the portrayal of death mirrors the broader transformation of divine authority. As gods withdraw from daily life, they retain control over boundaries rather than moments. They govern beginnings and endings, not experiences in between. Life becomes human. Death becomes procedural. The texts reflect this by focusing on continuity rather than loss. When a king dies, the emphasis is on succession. When a city is destroyed, the emphasis is on rebuilding. When populations are reduced, the emphasis is on survival. Survival is forward-looking. Mourning looks backward. A culture oriented toward endurance prioritizes continuity over grief. This does not mean grief disappears. It means it moves out of the official record. Laments still exist, but they are stylized, ritualized, contained. They do not interrupt the flow of history. They are performed at prescribed times, in prescribed ways. Ritual mourning replaces spontaneous grief. Ritual is controllable. Grief is not. In a system designed to manage scale, noise, and disruption, uncontrolled grief would be destabilizing. It would amplify emotion. It would draw attention to loss. It would challenge acceptance. By containing mourning within ritual, the system preserves stability. The gods benefit from this containment. A population that mourns privately and ritually does not question the structure that produces death. It accepts mortality as given. The texts reflect this acceptance by their tone. Death is mentioned without commentary. Lifespans are listed without regret. The passing of generations is presented as normal. Normality is powerful. Normality removes urgency. It removes the impulse to resist. This is particularly evident when compared to earlier narratives where death still shocks. In the antediluvian world, death is rare enough to be meaningful. In the post-flood world, death is so common that it barely registers. The gods do not intervene to prevent it. They do not explain it. They do not comfort humanity over it. Comfort would imply relationship. The absence of divine consolation reinforces distance. Humans learn to console themselves. They develop funerary practices. They build ancestor traditions. They remember the dead through names, lineage, and story, rather than through divine reassurance. Memory replaces divine care. This shift further reduces dependence on divine presence. Humans no longer look to gods to make sense of loss. They build meaning through continuity. Continuity becomes sacred. The gods remain associated with fate, but fate itself becomes something to endure rather than negotiate. Appeals to extend life become rare and symbolic. Only heroes attempt them, and they fail. Failure is instructive. The Epic of Gilgamesh again illustrates this reality. The death of Enkidu is mourned deeply, but it leads not to divine intervention, but to personal reckoning. Gilgamesh seeks immortality not because the gods offer it, but because they no longer do. When he fails, the lesson is acceptance, not rebellion. This lesson is consistent across the texts. Death is not to be challenged. It is to be accommodated. Accommodation stabilizes the system. A population that accommodates death does not demand divine presence to explain it. It does not expect gods to reverse it. It builds within the limits imposed. These limits were designed to prevent humanity from becoming too numerous, too loud, too persistent. Death ensures turnover. It ensures silence returns regularly. Silence, even temporary, resolves the original divine complaint. The gods in retreat no longer need to complain as loudly because death performs that function quietly and continuously. The absence of mourning in the official record is therefore not indifference. It is design. Design favours efficiency over expression. This design extends to how disasters are described. Plagues, famines, wars are noted, but rarely dwelt upon emotionally. They're events within a larger system. The system continues. The gods are invoked as causes or witnesses, but not as mourners. A God who mourns would acknowledge loss. A God who acknowledges loss might question necessity. The texts do not allow this. Instead, the gods are portrayed as maintaining order even as life ends. They ensure cycles continue. They do not pause to grieve individual deaths. This portrayal reinforces their role as distant administrators rather than relational beings. Humans mirror this distance in their own narratives. They record deaths, but they do not linger on them. History moves forward. Forward motion becomes the priority. The emotional cost of this orientation is real, but it is absorbed into culture rather than expressed in theology. By the time later texts are written, death is so normalized that it becomes a backdrop rather than a theme. The focus shifts to legacy, achievement, and continuity. These values align with a world where divine presence is minimal. Humans must find meaning within limited time. This search for meaning produces art, law, philosophy, and ritual. It does not produce renewed intimacy with the gods. The gods in turn remain silent. Silence reinforces acceptance. When death is described without mourning, it signals that the relationship between gods and humans has changed irreversibly. The gods no longer share in human suffering. They oversee it from afar. This oversight may be just, it may be necessary, but it is not intimate. The texts do not condemn this distance, they assume it. Assumption is the final stage of normalization. Once distance is assumed, it no longer feels like loss, it feels like reality. The gods fade further into abstraction. They are invoked at thresholds, not in daily life. They govern fate, not emotion. Humans, left to endure, build a world that accommodates death rather than resists it. This accommodation does not weaken humanity, it hardens it. Hardened systems persist. The gods, having imposed mortality and withdrawn, no longer need to manage grief. The system manages itself. Deaths continue, they are recorded, they are counted, they are replaced. Life goes on. This is not a story of cruelty, it is a story of adaptation. The absence of mourning in the text is not heartlessness, it is acceptance of a world redesigned to function without constant divine involvement. And as humanity adapts to death without expecting consolation, it adapts to life without expecting presence. From this point onward, the gods are no longer companions in suffering. They are distant authorities whose role is to maintain order, not to share experience. This quiet transformation prepares the ground for what follows. Silence deepens, presence fades further, the divine becomes something remembered rather than felt. And in a world where death is expected and rarely mourned in the record, the gods themselves begin to feel less alive. From here, the narrative moves towards silence, absence, and the lingering question of whether beings who no longer share in life or death can truly be said to remain part of the world at all. There comes a point in the record where absence becomes more noticeable than presence, not because the texts announce it, but because they no longer fill the space the way they once did. The gods are still named, their authority is still acknowledged, their domains are still defined, and yet the world they once occupied so visibly grows quiet in a way that feels deliberate. Earlier narratives are crowded with divine action. Gods speak directly. They intervene openly. They argue among themselves in scenes humans are allowed to witness. They walk, eat, sleep, and react within the same experiential space as humanity. Their presence dominates the rhythm of the world. Then gradually it does not. The silence does not arrive as emptiness. It arrives as reduction. Fewer appearances, fewer conversations, fewer moments where divine will interrupt the flow of human affairs. What replaces those moments is continuity. Human activity proceeds without interruption. Agriculture continues. Cities expand. Trade routes develop. Laws are enforced. The world does not collapse in the absence of constant divine presence. That is the unsettling realization preserved by the texts. Silence, once unthinkable, becomes sustainable. In earlier periods, silence would have signalled disorder. It would have suggested abandonment or danger. Divine voice was associated with stability. To hear nothing would have meant something was wrong. Later texts invert this expectation. Silence becomes the norm. Divine voice becomes exceptional. This inversion reshapes how authority is experienced. Authority that speaks constantly commands attention. Authority that remains silent relies on structure. The gods no longer instruct daily life. They underwrite it. Underwriting is quieter than command. The silence is most apparent in what the texts stop describing. They stop narrating gods moving through landscapes. They stop detailing divine meals and feasts. They stop recounting conversations between gods and humans about everyday concerns. Instead, divine activity retreats into origins and endpoints. The gods created the world. The gods established kingship. The gods will judge the dead. Between those points lies human life, largely uninterrupted. This narrative gap is not accidental. It reflects a world that has learned to function without constant divine input. Silence becomes a sign of success rather than failure. The gods, having imposed structural controls, no longer need to speak as often. Mortality regulates scale. Law governs behaviour. Memory preserves boundaries. The system runs. Running systems do not require constant oversight. The silence also protects the gods themselves. Presence made them vulnerable. Presence exposed them to noise, fatigue, and irritation. Silence shields them from disturbance. A god who does not speak cannot be interrupted. This protective function of silence becomes evident in how divine realms are described. The heavens grow distant. The underworld becomes closed and regulated. Access points narrow. Humans no longer expect response. They perform rituals without immediate feedback. They pray without hearing answers. They interpret silence as normal. Normalizing silence is a profound psychological shift. When silence is normalized, expectation changes. Humans stop waiting for gods to act. They stop asking why the gods are quiet. They assume quiet is the natural state. Assumption removes tension. The texts reflect this removal by focusing increasingly on human concerns. Political struggles, economic disputes, legal reforms, military campaigns. These narratives unfold with little divine commentary. When gods are mentioned, it is often as justification after the fact rather than guidance beforehand. After the fact, authority is symbolic. Symbols do not interrupt events, they frame them. The gods frame reality rather than shaping it moment by moment. This framing role preserves their status while minimizing their involvement. It allows reverence to persist without presence. Presence is costly. Reverence at a distance is efficient. The silence also changes the emotional texture of belief. When gods are present, belief is relational. It involves interaction, negotiation, even frustration. When gods are silent, belief becomes abstract. It is about acceptance rather than engagement. Abstract belief is stable. It does not fluctuate with mood or event. It endures. This endurance benefits both sides. Humans are not constantly disrupted by divine intervention. Gods are not constantly disturbed by human activity. The silence thus resolves the incompatibility that began the entire sequence of events. What is lost in this resolution is intimacy. The gods are no longer neighbours. They are no longer participants in shared space. They are distant authorities whose presence is inferred rather than experienced. Inference replaces encounter. Inference allows belief to persist even when experience does not confirm it. This is why silence does not lead to disbelief in the texts. It leads to formalization. Rituals become more precise. Doctrine becomes more fixed. Tradition becomes more important. Silence requires structure to maintain meaning. The gods are remembered through formula rather than story, through titles rather than actions, through attributes rather than experiences. Attributes are stable. Experiences change. Stability is the goal of a system that has endured catastrophe and restructuring. The silence also extends to divine emotion. Earlier gods express anger, joy, regret, fear. Later gods feel less, or rather, their feelings are no longer narrated. Emotion would imply engagement. Engagement would invite presence. By removing divine emotion from the narrative, the texts reinforce withdrawal. This withdrawal is not presented as abandonment. The gods still care in the sense that order is maintained, justice is enforced, fate is administered, care becomes impersonal. Impersonal care does not speak. The silence therefore signals a change in how divinity is understood. The gods are no longer beings whose lives intersect visibly with human lives. They are principles embedded in the structure of reality. Principles do not speak. They operate. Humans adapt to this mode of divinity. They no longer seek conversation. They seek alignment. They follow rules. They perform rituals. They accept outcomes. Acceptance reduces friction. The silence also changes how memory functions. Stories of divine presence are preserved as ancient history. They're not expected to repeat. They belong to a different age. This temporal distancing reinforces silence. What happened then is not expected now. Expectation is the enemy of silence. By removing expectation, the system stabilizes. The gods no longer need to defend their absence. Their absence is assumed. Silence becomes authority. An authority that does not need to speak appears absolute. Yet absolute silence carries its own consequence. It removes the gods from lived experience. Over time, what is not experienced becomes abstract. What is abstract becomes distant. Distance erodes immediacy. The gods remain powerful in name, but their influence is mediated entirely through human institutions. Priests interpret, kings enforce, laws regulate. The gods exist at the top of the structure, but they no longer move within it. This is the quiet end of presence, not a death, not a defeat, a transition. Silence fills the space where divine presence once dominated, and life continues within that silence. Humanity adapts fully. It learns to live without expecting divine interruption. It plans, it governs, it remembers. The gods, having retreated into silence, are no longer disturbed by noise. The original complaint has been resolved, but resolution carries a cost. The world is quieter in one sense, but lonelier in another. The silence does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. And that normality is the most telling sign of all. When silence, where divine presence once dominated, no longer surprises anyone, the transformation is complete. From here, the narrative moves deeper into absence, into the question of whether silence sustained long enough becomes indistinguishable from disappearance, and whether gods who no longer act within the world can still be said to inhabit it in any meaningful way. What begins to surface at this stage of the record is not an accusation, nor a declaration of victory, but a quiet imbalance in duration. Humanity remains. The gods recede. Nothing dramatic announces this shift. No final battle, no explicit defeat, no moment where divine authority is openly overturned. Instead, the difference appears in persistence. The gods withdraw, abstract, and fall silent. Humanity continues. This continuation is not framed as triumph. It is simply described as fact. Cities are rebuilt, fields are cultivated, lineages continue, writing expands, law evolves, memory is preserved and adapted. Human life, constrained and mortal, nevertheless fills the space that divine presence once occupied. Outlasting does not require confrontation. It requires endurance. The gods, as they are depicted in the later texts, do not vanish because they are destroyed. They vanish because their role within the daily operation of the world becomes unnecessary. Systems once dependent on divine oversight begin to function independently. Authority once enforced through presence becomes embedded in structure. When presence is no longer required, Withdrawal becomes sustainable. The texts never say that humans replace the gods. They do not elevate humanity into divinity. Instead, they show humans inheriting responsibility. Kings rule without daily divine instruction. Judges interpret law without constant revelation. Farmers plant and harvest without divine intervention at every step. This inheritance is not ceremonial. It is practical. The gods are still named, but naming alone does not constitute participation. Titles remain, but actions fade. Domains persist, but occupants grow distant. What matters is not belief, but function. A god who no longer functions within the system does not need to be defeated. The system simply moves forward without them. Humanity's advantage is not power, it is adaptability. Mortality, which was imposed as a limit, becomes a strength in this context. Short lifespans prevent stagnation. New generations adjust to conditions as they are, not as they were. Memory becomes selective. Old expectations dissolve. The world is accepted on its own terms. The gods, by contrast, are fixed. Their identities are stable. Their domains do not evolve. Their authority is tied to structures established in a world that no longer exists. This rigidity creates a quiet disadvantage. As human societies adapt, divine roles become symbolic. Gods become patrons of cities, embodiments of ideals, guarantors of order. They are invoked, but not encountered. Their relevance becomes conceptual rather than experiential. Concepts endure differently than participants. Human institutions, once stabilized, do not require constant divine input. Law codes regulate behavior. Contracts define obligation. Writing preserves precedent. Memory becomes externalized. Externalized memory reduces reliance on divine recall. In earlier ages, gods were needed to remember. They preserved order by remembering who owed what, who had done what, who deserved what. As writing develops, this function shifts to archives and records. When memory is stored materially, divine memory becomes redundant. This redundancy is not acknowledged openly. It is simply lived. The gods remain associated with origins. They created the world. They established kingship. They set the boundaries of existence. But origins recede into the past. The present is managed by those who inhabit it. Management replaces guidance. Guidance implies relationship. Management implies system. The gods move from relational beings to systemic references. Humanity does not rebel against this change, it accommodates it. Rituals continue. Offerings are made. Names are spoken. But these actions no longer interrupt daily life. They punctuate it. Punctuation is not presence. As centuries pass, the gods are invoked primarily at moments of transition. Birth, death, coronation, disaster. These are thresholds, not routines. The divine becomes associated with edges rather than centres. Edges are visited occasionally. Centres are lived in. Human life occupies the centre now. The texts reflect this shift by focusing increasingly on human affairs, political intrigue, economic exchange, legal reform, warfare, diplomacy. These narratives unfold without divine commentary. When gods are mentioned, it is often as justification rather than cause. Justification follows action. It does not initiate it. This reversal is subtle, but decisive. The gods no longer drive history. They sanction it retroactively. Sanctioning is a passive role. Passivity, sustained long enough, becomes absence. This absence does not feel sudden to those living within it. It feels normal. Each generation grows up expecting less divine presence than the one before. Silence becomes inherited. Inherited silence does not feel like loss. It feels like background. Humanity does not notice that it has outlasted the gods because nothing visibly ends. The gods are still spoken of, still honoured, still feared. But fear without encounter is different. Fear becomes abstract. It governs behaviour, but it does not shape imagination in the same way. Imagination turns inward. Humans begin to explore meaning without expecting divine response. Philosophy emerges, ethics develop. Art reflects human experience rather than divine command. These developments do not challenge the gods directly. They bypass them. Bypassing is quieter than rebellion, but more effective. The gods do not respond with renewed presence. They do not reclaim centrality. They allow the system to continue as it is. Allowance is another form of withdrawal. This allowance may be interpreted as benevolence, resignation, or inevitability. The texts do not clarify. They do not need to. The outcome is the same. Humanity persists. Persistence reshapes authority. A being that must be remembered to remain relevant occupies a different position than one that is encountered daily. Memory preserves form, but it does not sustain influence in the same way. As divine presence fades, gods become increasingly tied to tradition. Tradition preserves names, rituals, and stories. It does not preserve immediacy. Immediacy belongs to lived experience. Human experience fills the narrative space once occupied by divine action. This filling is not aggressive. It is natural. Fields must be planted. Disputes must be resolved. Children must be raised. Death must be endured. Life demands attention. The gods, having withdrawn, do not compete for it. Outlasting, in this sense, is not about victory. It is about occupying time. Humanity occupies time fully. The gods occupy memory. Memory can last indefinitely, but it does not act. Action belongs to those who remain engaged. The texts never frame this as humanity surpassing the gods. They frame it as humanity continuing under conditions designed to limit it. Those limits succeed in preventing excess, but they also make divine presence unnecessary. Necessity is the foundation of authority. Once authority is no longer necessary for daily functioning, it becomes symbolic. Symbols persist without participation. This symbolic persistence allows gods to remain honoured without remaining involved. Humanity does not kill the gods. It does not overthrow them. It does not deny them. It simply lives. Living under these conditions is enough. The gods, as distant overseers, do not intervene to reclaim centrality. They appear content to remain at the margins. Their silence suggests acceptance. Acceptance is the final stage of withdrawal. By the time later texts are written, divine presence is something that happened once, long ago. It belongs to a different age. It is not expected to return. Expectation has shifted permanently. The gods exist as background assumptions. Humanity exists as foreground reality. Foreground reality shapes history. The gods in the background do not disappear entirely. They influence through concept, law, and tradition, but they no longer shape events moment to moment. Outlasting does not require disappearance. It requires irrelevance. Irrelevance is too strong a word for how the texts present it. The gods are still relevant in theory. They're no longer required in practice. This distinction explains the quiet tone of the later material. There is no sense of loss, no sense of triumph. There is only continuation. Humanity carries forward under the rules imposed after the catastrophe. Mortality, distance, silence. Within those rules, humanity adapts fully. The gods, having imposed the rules that make their withdrawal sustainable, recede without resistance. What remains is a world that functions. A functioning world does not ask where its gods have gone, it simply continues. And in that continuation lies the most unsettling implication of all. Not that humanity defeated the gods, but that the world learned to exist without their presence at its centre. From here, the narrative moves toward memory, myth, and abstraction, toward a stage where the gods are preserved in story rather than encountered in life, and where endurance, not obedience, defines what it means to remain. The question of outlasting no longer needs to be asked. The answer is lived. As divine presence recedes and silence settles into the structure of the world, the function of myth changes in a way that is easy to misunderstand if one assumes that myths exist primarily to glorify gods. In the earliest layers, myth does not feel like worship. It feels like record-keeping, an attempt to preserve memory of how things once worked, how authority was exercised, and how proximity between gods and humans shaped the world. As withdrawal progresses, myth stops describing participation and begins describing aftermath. This shift is subtle, but decisive. Myths no longer center on ongoing divine activity. They center on events that are finished: creation, catastrophe, withdrawal, judgment. These are not repeated experiences, they are remembered ones. Myth becomes a container for loss. This does not mean that myth becomes critical or hostile toward the gods. It means that myth begins to function as an archive rather than a celebration. It preserves what is no longer accessible. It explains why certain conditions exist without inviting them to change. In a world where gods are present, worship is experiential. It responds to interaction. It reacts to blessing, punishment, favour or denial. In a world where gods are distant, worship becomes symbolic. It acknowledges authority without expecting response. Myth supports symbolic worship by explaining absence. Stories of divine conflict, flood, destruction and withdrawal do not encourage renewed closeness. They justify distance. They explain why the world is the way it is and why it should not be otherwise. This explanatory function is crucial. Without it, silence would feel like abandonment. With it, silence feels inevitable. The myths preserve memory of a collapse, not in the sense of a sudden disaster, but in the sense of a gradual failure of coexistence. The gods and humans could not remain in the same experiential space indefinitely. Something had to give. What gave was presence. Myth records this giving way without naming it as defeat. It presents divine withdrawal as consequence rather than failure. The world grew too loud. Humanity grew too numerous. Order required distance. These stories are not told to invite return. They're told to prevent expectation. Expectation is destabilizing. If humans expected gods to walk among them again, the silence would feel wrong. By framing divine presence as something that belonged to an earlier age, myth removes that expectation entirely. The gods are not absent because something is broken. They are absent because time has moved forward. Time in myth becomes a dividing force. There is a before and an after. The before is populated by gods who act openly. The after is populated by humans who endure. Endurance becomes the defining virtue of the present age. Myth supports endurance by reframing loss as order. Mortality is not tragic. It is necessary. Distance is not abandonment. It is structure. Silence is not neglect. It is stability. These reframings are not neutral. They shape psychology. They teach acceptance. Acceptance replaces devotion as the core religious posture. Devotion seeks closeness. Acceptance tolerates distance. The myths emphasize boundaries repeatedly. Humans who cross boundaries suffer. Heroes who seek what belongs to the gods fail. Kings who overreach are corrected. These stories do not inspire rebellion. They warn against it. Warning is a function of control. Control no longer requires presence. It requires narrative. Narrative can operate indefinitely without action. As myths accumulate, they begin to overlap and repeat. Floods appear in multiple traditions. Withdrawals are told in different forms. Deaths of gods are hinted at but never resolved. Silence is encoded again and again. Repetition signals that these stories are doing work. The work they do is not to inspire worship, but to stabilize expectation. A population that understands its world as the aftermath of divine collapse will not seek to restore what cannot be restored. It will build within limits. This is why myths increasingly focus on origins and endings, not middles. The middle is where humans live now. The middle belongs to them. The gods occupy the edges of time. Edge occupation is safer. It keeps divine power intact while removing it from daily negotiation. Myth becomes the place where gods still act freely, because myth exists outside time. In lived reality, they no longer do. This division allows reverence to persist without disruption. Humans can honour gods in story without expecting them to intervene in life. This arrangement benefits both sides. The gods remain authoritative in narrative. Humans remain autonomous in practice. Myth also preserves contradictions. Gods are powerful yet constrained, eternal yet absent, just yet destructive. These contradictions are not resolved because they no longer need to be. Resolution would invite action. Unresolved myth invites contemplation instead. Contemplation does not threaten structure. As writing spreads, myths are fixed, versions are copied, variations are preserved. This fixing freezes divine action permanently in the past. Frozen action cannot return. The gods become figures of memory rather than experience. Their stories are told, but their presence is not felt. This is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of withdrawal. Worship adapts accordingly. Ritual honours names. Festivals reenact myths. Priests recite stories. None of this requires gods to appear. Appearance would disrupt the system. The myths do not ask the gods to return. They explain why they should not. They teach that the world cannot sustain that level of proximity again. Noise, labour, death, scale. All of these pressures remain. The myths remember what happens when boundaries collapse. Memory becomes warning. This is why myth, in its later function, feels heavy rather than celebratory. It carries weight. It explains loss. It encodes restraint. It is not the voice of devotion. It is the voice of survival. The collapse it records is not the destruction of the gods themselves, but the collapse of a shared world. Gods and humans once occupied overlapping space. That overlap failed. Myth preserves the record of that failure so it does not repeat. From this perspective, myth is conservative. It protects the present order by discouraging attempts to change it. The gods do not need to enforce distance actively. Myth enforces it culturally. Children learn early that the gods belong to another time, that closeness ended for a reason, that endurance, not intimacy, defines the present. These lessons are not explicit. They are absorbed through story. Story is more effective than command. Command invites resistance. Story shapes expectation. As myth replaces worship as the primary mode of engagement, the gods become less immediate but more stable. They exist beyond challenge because they exist beyond reach. Reachability is dangerous. Myth makes gods unreachable again, not through power, but through time. Time cannot be crossed. This temporal distancing completes the withdrawal that began with complaint and punishment. The gods no longer need to hide. They're already gone in the only way that matters. They remain as narrative anchors, as explanations, as limits. Humanity lives in the space between myths. This space is where law, culture, and memory develop independently. Myth no longer governs action. It governs meaning. Meaning sustains order without intervention. This is the final transformation of the divine-human relationship, from presence to authority to silence to story. Story does not demand response, and in that quiet, humanity continues. From here, the narrative moves toward the last stage of this process, where even memory begins to thin, and where the gods are no longer active even in myth, but reduced to names, lists, and echoes, raising the final question of whether something that exists only as record can still be said to exist at all. There is a point at which the question no longer concerns where the gods went, but what they were to begin with. Once silence has settled, once myth has replaced presence, once authority has become symbolic rather than lived, a more unsettling implication emerges quietly from the texts. What if the gods were never eternal in the way later belief would require them to be? The earliest records do not insist on divine eternality. They do not frame the gods as unchanging absolutes that exist outside time. Instead, they present beings who are born, who organize themselves, who assume roles, who argue, who tire, and who withdraw. These are not metaphors, they are descriptions. The gods enter the record at a moment. They do not appear as timeless givens. They appear as participants in a system that already exists. Even the genealogies of the gods suggest sequence rather than infinity. One generation gives rise to another. Authority shifts. Roles are reassigned. Domains are inherited. A being who has a lineage is already embedded in time. Time is the enemy of eternality. The texts never pause to resolve this tension because for those who wrote them, the tension may not have existed. The gods were powerful, not infinite. They were enduring, not timeless. They were necessary within a certain configuration of the world, not beyond all possible worlds. When that configuration changes, their role changes with it. If the gods were not eternal, then withdrawal is not an anomaly. It is an outcome. Beings that exist within time are subject to time's pressures, fatigue, irrelevance, obsolescence. These are not moral failures. They are structural realities. The gods complain because they are affected. They punish because they are strained. They withdraw because they cannot remain embedded without cost. None of this fits comfortably with later ideas of eternal, immutable divinity, but it fits precisely with the record as it exists. Eternity is never asserted explicitly in the earliest material. It is assumed later. Assumption changes interpretation. When later traditions read these texts through the lens of eternality, withdrawal becomes mysterious. Silence becomes troubling. Absence becomes a problem that must be explained away. But if the gods were not eternal, silence is not troubling at all. It is expected. A being that is not eternal does not disappear dramatically. It diminishes. It retreats. It becomes less relevant. It survives in memory long after it ceases to act. This is how institutions fade. This is how empires end. This is how authority dissolves. The gods, in this light, resemble administrators of an earlier order rather than eternal principles. They governed a world that required their presence. When that world changed, their governance became unnecessary. Necessity is the true measure of power. The texts reflect this shift without commentary. They stop describing divine intervention, not because scribes forgot how to write such stories, but because such interventions no longer occurred in ways that mattered. The world continued without them. Continuity without divine action is the strongest argument against eternality. If the gods were eternal in function, their presence would persist regardless of circumstance. Instead, their presence correlates with specific conditions: proximity, scale, labour, noise. These are environmental variables, not eternal truths. Once those variables change, divine presence changes too. This suggests that the gods were bound to the world in a way later theology would find uncomfortable. They were sustained by offerings. They required temples. They needed ritual to remain connected. They depended on humans for remembrance. Dependence is incompatible with absolute eternality. The texts are explicit about divine dependence on sacrifice. After the flood, the gods hunger. They cluster around offerings. They rely on human ritual to sustain them. A being that requires sustenance is not eternal in the absolute sense. It is contingent. Contingent beings endure as long as conditions allow. When conditions shift, contingency becomes vulnerability. The gradual withdrawal of the gods aligns perfectly with this vulnerability. As humanity adapts, as systems become autonomous, as memory becomes externalized, the gods lose the supports that sustain their presence. They do not die in battle. They are not destroyed. They simply cease to be required. This is a different kind of ending. If the gods were not eternal, then their disappearance is not a cosmic catastrophe. It is a historical process, like the fading of old authorities, the collapse of old orders, the end of old ways of governing. The myths preserve traces of this process, stories of gods who are bound, injured, trapped, or killed temporarily, stories of divine figures who retreat into the underworld and do not return fully, stories of power that diminishes rather than explodes. These are not symbolic of eternal cycles. They are records of decline. Decline is rarely acknowledged directly by those living through it. It is recognized only in hindsight. The scribes who preserved these texts did not need to explain that the gods were fading. They recorded what they saw. Fewer appearances, less involvement, more abstraction, more distance. Abstraction is the final refuge of non-eternal authority. When a being can no longer act, it becomes an idea. Ideas do not age. They do not tire. They do not require sustenance. By becoming ideas, the gods preserve a form of eternity that does not require presence. This transformation may not have been deliberate. It may have been the only way for divine authority to persist at all. If the gods were not eternal, then myth is not merely remembrance, it is preservation. Preservation freezes what cannot continue. The gods survive in names, attributes, lists, and stories. They are catalogued, systematized, assigned functions within theology rather than reality. Cataloguing is an act of closure. Once something is catalogued, it is no longer active. It is known. It is contained. The later theological insistence on eternality may itself be a response to this containment, a way to deny decline by redefining existence. If the gods are eternal in essence, then their absence does not matter. But the earliest texts do not require this reassurance. They do not protest disappearance. They accept it. Acceptance suggests familiarity with impermanence. Humans living under shortened lifespans understand impermanence intimately. They see generations rise and fall. They know that endurance does not guarantee permanence. It would not have been strange to them to imagine gods subject to similar constraints. The gods may have lived longer. They may have wielded greater power, but they were still part of the same reality. If this is so, then the question is no longer whether humanity killed the gods, but whether the gods were ever built to last in a world that would eventually no longer need them. Outlasting, then, is not a crime. It is a consequence. Humanity persists because it adapts. The gods recede because they are fixed. Fixity fails in changing systems. The texts never mourn the gods' absence explicitly. They do not lament a fallen heaven. They do not describe cosmic grief. They simply move on. Moving on is the clearest signal of non-eternality. If the gods were eternal, their absence would destabilize everything. Instead, life continues. Law continues. Memory continues. Meaning continues. Only presence does not. This absence is not filled by new gods in the same way. Later deities emerge, but they are different. More abstract. More moral. Less embodied. Less involved. This evolution suggests learning. A system that failed once is redesigned to avoid the same failure again. Eternal gods who cannot be disturbed by noise, fatigue, or labour emerge conceptually only after the gods who are disturbed fade away. In this sense, eternality may be a theological invention born from collapse. If the gods were not eternal, then the end of their presence is not tragedy. It is transition. The world they governed ends. A new world begins. Humanity inherits that world, bounded, mortal, quiet enough to function. The gods remain as memory, as structure, as explanation. They do not return because return is not possible within the new configuration. Possibility has changed. And if eternality depends on relevance, then a being that no longer participates in the world cannot be eternal in any meaningful sense. The gods exist now only where time does not matter, in story, in abstraction, in concept. Time moves on without them. This realization does not require disbelief. It does not require rebellion. It doesn't require denial. It requires only observation. The texts observed texts, and in observing they left open a final implication that they never state directly, but never close off either. If the gods were not eternal, then their end was not an event. It was a process, and processes do not end with a single moment. They fade. From here, the narrative reaches its quiet conclusion, not with judgment or revelation, but with reflection on what remains when authority has faded, presence has withdrawn, and only memory continues to carry the shape of what once ruled the world. As the record grows quiet, as names thin into lists and stories harden into tradition, what remains is not an answer so much as a condition. The world continues. Fields are planted, children are born, laws are enforced, death arrives when it always has. Nothing in the structure of daily life suggests that something essential is missing. And yet, something has ended. If the gods ended, not through catastrophe or overthrow, but through withdrawal, irrelevance, and time, then the question is not where they went, but what fills the space they once occupied. The earliest texts do not offer comfort here. They do not replace the gods with something new in a dramatic sense. They do not announce a new order with equal presence and authority. Instead, they allow the space to remain open. What fills that space is continuity. Humanity remains not because it was chosen, but because it endured. It learned to live within limits imposed to control it. Mortality, distance, silence. These were meant to stabilize the world, and they succeeded. But in stabilizing the world, they also made constant divine presence unnecessary. What remains, then, is not divine rule, but human responsibility. This responsibility is not framed as empowerment or triumph. It is framed as burden. Humans inherit a world that functions, but only because it is constrained. A world that does not require gods to intervene daily, but also does not offer the ease or intimacy that once existed. The texts do not celebrate this inheritance. They accept it. Acceptance is the final posture of a species that has survived suppression, catastrophe, and distance. It does not seek to reopen what has closed. It does not ask for return. The gods, in this quiet ending, are not mourned because mourning would imply expectation of restoration. They are not cursed because cursing would imply conflict. They are simply remembered. Memory is what remains of beings who no longer act. Memory does not govern, it informs. What governs now are systems humans maintain themselves. Law, custom, tradition. These systems carry traces of divine origin, but they function without divine presence. This is not abandonment, it is succession. Succession does not require announcement. It happens when one generation continues after another has withdrawn. If the gods ended, then humanity did not replace them as gods. It replaced them as caretakers of the world they once managed. Caretaking is quieter than rule. Caretaking does not command. It maintains. The texts show this maintenance everywhere. In irrigation systems that continue without divine instruction. In courts that apply law without revelation. In rituals that honour names without expecting response. These practices do not bring the gods back. They preserve stability. Stability is what matters now. The gods once provided stability through presence. Now stability is provided through structure. Structure does not feel sacred in the same way. It feels ordinary, reliable, impersonal. Impersonality is safe. In a world where divine presence once brought both order and catastrophe, safety becomes more valuable than intimacy. The gods, if they were not eternal, leave behind a lesson rather than a legacy. A lesson about scale, about proximity, about the cost of shared space between vastly different forms of existence. Humanity learns that survival does not require closeness to power. It requires adaptability. Adaptability allows humans to live without gods walking among them. It allows them to build meaning without divine conversation. It allows them to endure loss without expecting explanation. This endurance is not heroic. It is quiet. Quiet is the dominant tone of the later record. Quiet suggests resolution, not because everything is right, but because nothing is breaking anymore. The gods are no longer present to be disturbed. Humanity is no longer present to be suppressed. Each occupies a separate domain. If the gods remain anywhere, they remain in memory, in story, in names spoken without expectation. They remain as boundaries rather than companions, and boundaries, once accepted, cease to cause pain. The question of who remains, then, has a simple answer that the texts never state outright, but consistently imply. What remains is the world itself, a world that no longer requires divine oversight to function, a world that operates under limits that prevent excess, a world shaped by catastrophe, refined by distance and stabilized by silence. Within that world, humanity remains not as conqueror, not as rebel, but as inhabitant. Inhabitation is not dominance, it is persistence. The gods may still exist as concept, as abstraction, as principle. But existence without presence is different. It does not shape the rhythm of life. Life's rhythm belongs to those who remain engaged. Humans engage because they must. They build because they live briefly. They remember because they know time erases. They govern because no one else will. This necessity produces culture. Culture fills the space gods once occupied, not with replacement divinity, but with meaning. Meaning does not need gods to speak. It needs memory, continuity, and shared understanding. The oldest texts end not with revelation, but with lists, names, reigns, measurements, records. Records belong to humans. Recording is what one does when presence is gone and memory must be preserved deliberately. If the gods ended, they ended not in fire or judgment, but in quiet irrelevance. And irrelevance is not annihilation. It is absence of necessity. The world no longer needs gods to function. That does not mean the world is better. It means the world is stable. Stability was the goal of every intervention, every punishment, every suppression, every withdrawal. Stability has been achieved. What remains now is a species that lives within that stability, aware of its limits, aware of its mortality, aware of stories that speak of another time. That awareness does not lead to longing, it leads to acceptance. Acceptance allows rest. And rest is the final resolution of a narrative that began with gods who could not sleep because the world had become too loud. The world is quiet enough now, not silent but manageable. The gods do not need to complain. Humanity does not need to rebel. Both have found their distance. As you settle into rest, that quiet distance is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the ancient world. Not the presence of gods, but the space left behind when they step away. A space filled by continuity, a space filled by life, a space that remains, even when those who once ruled it no longer do. And in that space the world goes on. That is what remains. Nothing dramatic, nothing final, just persistence, carrying forward under a sky that no longer answers, but no longer interrupts either. A world stable enough to endure, and quiet enough, at last, to sleep.